The first principle of archaeometallurgy was simple: matter tells a story. A story more honest than any text, more reliable than any myth. To Dr. Elara Vance, a sliver of bronze was a paragraph, a shard of iron a chapter. You just had to know the language. It was a language of isotopes and crystalline structures, of trace elements and thermal scarring. It was a language of logic, of predictable decay and verifiable composition. It did not lie. For 3 weeks in the Anatolian sun, the door had been telling her a story she refused to believe. It was a lie. It had to be. It sat deep within a newly uncovered section of the Derinquiu underground complex, a perfect, seamless circle of metal 50 meters below the ferry chimneys and tourist buses of Cappadocia. Ground-penetrating radar had screamed about the anomaly for months. A void behind a material so dense it defied initial scans. Now, standing before it in the cool, generator-lit air of the chamber, Elara felt the lie pressing against her skin. The door was 12 feet in diameter, its surface a swirl of dark gray and obsidian black, like oil on water frozen mid-churn. It wasn't Hittite, not Byzantine, not anything that had a right to be here. Her portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer had given readings that were, to put it mildly, absurd. Tungsten, osmium, a trace of iridium, and something else, something the machine's library had no name for. The composition was closer to a modern satellite heat shield than an ancient artifact. The power cell for the plasma torch is at 78%, a voice crackled through her earpiece. Hawken, her lead technician. We can make another pass, Dr. Vance. Maybe another hour. Elara leaned closer. Her headlamp beam sliding over the impossibly smooth surface. No seams. No hinges. No lock. It was fused to the volcanic tuff as if it had been poured into place. Proceed, Hawken. Shave another millimeter off the perimeter. Slow and steady. She ran a gloved finger over the metal. It was cool, unnaturally so, leaching the warmth from her fingertips through the insulated fabric. Behind her, a quiet presence shifted. She didn't need to turn to know it was Kenan Demir, the guide the ministry had assigned her. A man whose own story was etched into the lines around his eyes. My grandmother used to say this part of the earth was for sleeping, Kenan said, his voice a low rumble that didn't quite echo in the sound-dampening rock. She said some things are buried so they are not forgotten, but so they do not remember us. Elara straightened up, turning to face him. Charming, Kenan. But I work with facts, not folklore. And the fact is, this door is a technological aberration. A hoax, most likely. An elaborate, incredibly well-funded one. She tapped a console on her wrist, bringing up the spectral analysis again. The unnamed element spiked at the edge of the graph, a silent scream in the data. There are hoaxes, Doctor, Kenan said, his gaze fixed on the door. Not her. And there are warnings. It is not always easy to tell the difference. He spoke of local legends, of smiths who could hammer the silence into shape and of a city built not to keep people in, but to swallow a fallen star that was poisoning the ground. Elara had listened with the polite, partitioned attention she reserved for such tales, interesting cultural data points, but ultimately noise. Now, in the sterile bubble of light surrounded by ancient darkness, the noise was getting harder to ignore. The high-pitched whine of the plasma torch intensified, a blade of pure heat scoring a line of incandescent orange against the door's dark metal. It was the only sound in the world. And then it wasn't. The torch sputtered and died. The generators whined down into silence. The emergency LED strips on the floor flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. Hawken. Report, Elara commanded, her voice sharp. Static. Then, Hawken's panicked voice. Power fluctuation. All systems are down. The primary generator, it's dead. So is the backup. Impossible. They had enough fuel to run for a week. She felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the metal door. It was a phantom feeling, a ghost from a decade ago. From another darkness, another silence. She ruthlessly suppressed it. Check the fuel lines. Check the inverters. Now. She turned back to the door. The orange line from the plasma torch was already fading, the metal healing itself, the deep gray swallowing the light. In the center of the cut, for a barest fraction of a second, she thought she saw the metal turn liquid, swirl, and then solidify again, leaving no trace of the cut. A trick of the light. A retinal burn from the plasma. It had to be. Because the only other explanation was that the door was not telling a lie. It was telling a truth her world had no language for. The backup generators remained stubbornly silent. Hawkins' reports grew more frantic, then resigned. It wasn't a fuel problem, it was as if the very potential for combustion had been temporarily suspended. Elara, standing in the oppressive quiet, logged it as unexplained atmospheric interference, a term vague enough to sound scientific while admitting nothing. For 2 hours they waited, a team of 21st-century minds rendered impotent by a power failure that defied their diagnostics. Keenan sat on a low rock, watching her. He hadn't said a word, his placid expression an unnerving counterpoint to the tight knot of frustration in Elara's stomach. She was a scientist. She solved problems. This was a problem. A logistical one. Nothing more. The memory of the cave, the darkness, the feeling of being trapped, tried to surface. She shoved it back down with a fresh wave of analytical fury. The alloy's thermal dissipation rate is off the charts, she spoke into her personal recorder, turning her back on Keenan as if his silence were an accusation. Even with direct plasma application, the heat signature on the surrounding rock is negligible. It's containing the energy. Or, consuming it. That was when the low hum started. It wasn't from their equipment. It was coming from the door. A deep, resonant frequency that vibrated not in the air, but directly in the bones of her skull. Her team felt it too, hands going to their heads, faces etched with confusion. Elara's wrist console, which had been dormant, flickered to life. The spectral analysis was running on its own, the graph now a chaotic mess. The spike for the unknown element was pulsing in time with the hum. The door, the seamless, impenetrable door, began to change. The swirling patterns of gray and black started to move, slowly, like a galaxy in time-lapse. They coalesced into a perfect circle in the center, which grew darker and darker. Until it seemed to be drinking the light from their emergency LEDs. "Doctor," Hawkins' voice was a whisper in her ear. "What is that?" "It's an iris," she breathed. She was watching an aperture open. Not mechanically, but organically, the metal itself dilating like the pupil of a vast eye. The humming stopped. In its place was a silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. A void where sound should be. From the newly opened, perfectly circular entryway, a puff of air, cold and sterile and tasting of ozone and nothingness, washed over them. It was open. For a long moment, nobody moved. The mission protocol was clear, any uncontrolled breach required an immediate withdrawal and quarantine. But this wasn't an uncontrolled breach. It felt like an invitation. Elara found herself walking forward, her scientific curiosity overriding years of safety training. The lie was over. The real story was just beyond this threshold, and she had to read it. "Dr. Vance, wait." Hawkins' protest was thin, distant. She paused at the edge of the opening, peering into a darkness that seemed to have a texture. Keenan was suddenly beside her. "My grandmother also said," he murmured, his voice sounding shockingly loud in the profound stillness, "that when a star falls, it does not die. It just finds a new sky to burn in. Be careful what sky you step into, Doctor." She ignored him, activating the more powerful lamp on her shoulder rig. The beam shot into the darkness, and for the first time in her career, Elara Vance had no words for what she saw. The passage beyond wasn't rock. It was lined with the same dark, metallic alloy, polished to a mirror finish. But it wasn't a tunnel. It was a throat. The architecture was sharp, geometric, impossibly precise. Angles and lines converged in ways that made her head ache, a subtle violation of Euclidean space. And the walls were covered in billions of microscopic, etched lines. Not writing. Not symbols. It looked like the grooves of a phonograph record, but one that wrapped around the entire corridor. A story waiting for a needle. Her team was gathering behind her. A collective gasp rippling through them. Ambient radiation is negative, Hawkins stuttered over the comm. That's not a malfunction. The reading is negative. It's sucking the background radiation out of the chamber. That's impossible. Elara took a step inside. The air was cold, so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. She ran a gloved hand along the etched wall. It was smooth as glass. This wasn't a city. It wasn't a tomb. It was a machine. And it had just turned itself on. The first chamber was a perfect cube, roughly 50 feet on each side. The unnatural stillness persisted, swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Their voices felt thin, stripped of resonance. Here, the etched lines on the walls were denser, forming vast, intricate patterns that spiraled into central medallions. Elara's mind, trained to see order, immediately began to process, to categorize. It's not a language, she said, her voice sounding small. It's mathematics. Or chemistry. She moved closer to one of the medallions, her light tracing the elegant, terrifyingly complex lines. This looks like a molecular diagram. But for a molecule with 100,000 atoms. A young geologist on her team, Baz, nervously pointed his own light upwards. Doctor, there are no chisel marks. No seams. The corners of this room are perfect right angles. How do you carve volcanic tuff into a perfect cube and then line it with an impossible alloy? You don't, Elara murmured, a thrill of pure, terrifying discovery coursing through her. You print it. It was the only explanation that fit the data, and it was ludicrous. 3D printing on a monumental scale. Millennia ago. Before she could process the thought, her wrist console beeped. An incoming message from the surface team. Elara, what's going on down there? We lost your team's telemetry for 2 minutes. It just came back online. It was Dr. Eris Thorne, the project director, his voice tinny with worry. Elara frowned. Eris, we've had continuous telemetry. We've been inside for maybe 10 minutes. A pause. Then Thorne's voice, strained. Elara, you've been in there for 3 hours. A chill, colder than the chamber's air, washed over her. Time dilation. The laws of physics were not merely being ignored here, they were being rewritten. She looked at Keenan, whose face was unreadable in the stark light. He simply nodded, as if she were a student finally grasping a difficult lesson. Ignoring the growing panic from her team, Elara focused on the medallion. There was a repeating symbol within the complex diagram, a small, stylized icon that looked like a serpent eating its own tail, but with a sun at its center. The Ouroboros. A symbol not of geology or chemistry, but of alchemy. With a sickening lurch, she remembered a passage from a text she had once studied only to debunk, an obscure treatise by Zosimos of Panopolis. The process is the transmutation not of the metal, but of the principles that bind it. To refine the world, one must first unmake it. This wasn't a hoax, she whispered to herself. It was a laboratory. She turned her attention to the next passageway leading deeper into the complex. It was darker, the light from their lamps seeming to shrink as it penetrated the corridor. We need to go deeper, she announced. Her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. Doctor, with all due respect, Hawken protested, protocol demands we withdraw. Time dilation, radiation sinks, we don't know what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the single greatest discovery in human history, Hawken, she countered, her intellectual pride flaring up, a shield against the rising fear. And I am not leaving until I have quantifiable data. It was a lie. She wasn't thinking about data anymore. She was thinking about the story the walls were telling her, and she was desperate, suddenly, to read the next page. As she strode toward the next corridor, Keenan fell into step beside her. "The old stories say the smiths who built this place hammered with a silent forge," he said quietly. "They were not shaping metal. They were shaping the rules. And a rule that can be shaped can also be broken." The second corridor was different. The polished walls began to show faint, cloudy imperfections. As Alara passed, she saw her reflection, but it lagged a half-second behind her movement. She stopped, and her reflection stopped a moment later. A dizzying wave of vertigo washed over her, and with it, a flash of memory so sharp it stole her breath: darkness, the smell of damp earth, the pressure of rock, and the sound of a man's fading voice calling her name. Alara. Just hang on. She squeezed her eyes shut, one hand braced against the cold, time-delayed wall. "No," she muttered. Atmospheric composition, psychoactive gases, her scientific mind scrambled for a foothold, for a rational explanation. "The air here is clean, Doctor," Keenan said, his voice gentle but firm. "It is the place itself that is not." She pushed off the wall and forced herself to continue, her heart hammering against her ribs. This place was reaching into her, pulling at the threads of a trauma she had buried under a mountain of logic. The idea was absurd. It was also undeniable. They emerged into a second chamber, this one a vast, vertical shaft that descended into perfect blackness. A narrow, spiraling ramp, seemingly unsupported, hugged the wall. It was a descent into the maw. "My equipment is malfunctioning," Hawkins said, his voice tight with panic. "The compass is spinning, and the gravimeter." "Doctor, the gravimeter is reading 1.02 g, gravity is stronger here." "Stronger? Like the pressure in the cave." Alara felt a terrible, magnetic pull. The story was down there. The end of it. The truth. Her fear and her curiosity had merged into a single, irresistible impulse. "We're going down," she said. The descent was a nightmare of subtle physics. The spiraling ramp was wide enough for only single file, forcing them into a vulnerable, elongated line. The increased gravity was a physical burden, making each step feel heavy, deliberate. Alara's legs, conditioned by years of fieldwork, began to ache with a deep, resonant throb. It was the feeling of being pressed down, of being compacted by the sheer weight of the earth above. Worse were the acoustic anomalies. Their footsteps, which should have echoed in the vast shaft, were swallowed whole. But occasionally, a single, distinct sound would detach itself and repeat moments later from an impossible direction: the click of a boot heel from above, the rustle of a jacket from below. The place was a distorted echo chamber, playing tricks with time and space. Alara tried to focus on the walls of the shaft. The etched lines continued their descent. But the patterns were changing. The orderly, complex diagrams of the upper chamber were giving way to more chaotic, frantic scribbles. It looked like the transition from a precise blueprint to a panicked stream of consciousness. She saw symbols that were recognizably alchemical: the solar lion devouring the lunar serpent, the peacock's tail, the black sun of Nigredo, but they were rendered with a desperate energy. This wasn't a record of creation anymore. It was a record of containment. "Keenan," she said, her breath misting in the cold air. "The legends, did they say what the Smiths were hammering the silence into?" "They didn't hammer it into anything, Doctor," he replied from behind her. "They hammered it down. They were trying to keep it from rising. The stories say it was a piece of the night sky that forgot it was meant to be above. A piece of the night sky. Prima materia. The raw, unformed stuff of creation." Alara's mind raced, connecting the esoteric philosophy of the alchemists to the impossible physics around her. They hadn't been trying to turn lead into gold. They had been working with the source code of reality itself. It was then that Baz, the young geologist, screamed. He was a few places behind Alara in the line. He had stopped, pointing his flashlight at the wall. "My shadow," he choked out. "Look at my shadow." They all turned. In the beam of his own headlamp, Baza's shadow was projected onto the curved wall as expected. But it was falling the wrong way. It was falling towards the light, a dark, sharp silhouette that grew smaller and crisper as he moved his lamp closer. It was a physical contradiction, a simple, terrifying inversion of the most basic law of light. That was when the real panic began. 2 members of the technical team turned and scrambled back up the ramp, ignoring Alara's orders to hold their position. Their panicked shouts were swallowed by the shaft's oppressive silence. Alara fought to keep her own fear in check. "Hakan, keep the rest of the team here. Keenan, with me. We have to see where this goes." "There is no seeing here, Alara," Keenan said, using her first name for the first time. His voice was grim. "There is only feeling your way through the dark. This place is older than sight." They continued down, the 2 of them alone, the ramp spiraling deeper into the cold, silent dark. The walls were now almost entirely chaotic scratches. Alara noticed something new. Amidst the alchemical symbols were crude handprints, hundreds of them, seared into the metal as if pressed there by hands white-hot with energy or pain. They reached a landing. Another circular doorway that led horizontally into the rock. This time, the silence was different. It was heavier. Expectant. As they stepped through, Alara's headlamp flickered and died. Keenan's did the same a moment later. They were plunged into absolute, total blackness. "Alara?" Keenan's voice was close. "I'm here." Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She fumbled for the emergency chemical light stick on her belt. She cracked it. It did not glow. She cracked it again, harder, the plastic groaning under the pressure. Nothing. The chemical reaction that produced light, another fundamental law of nature, had simply failed to occur. "They called it the Sessai's Yankee," Keenan whispered in the suffocating dark. "The silent echo. Not because it is quiet. But because it is the place where echoes go to die. Where everything goes to die." Alara felt a scream rising in her throat. A primal terror that threatened to shatter her analytical mind. This was it. This was the darkness from the cave. The pressure. The feeling of being utterly, hopelessly trapped in a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. Her carefully constructed wall of rationalism, built over a decade to keep this very feeling at bay, crumbled into dust. She was no longer a scientist. She was a child, lost in an impossible night. And in that total, lightless, soundless void, something moved. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't a breath. It was a shift in the quality of the nothingness before them. Alara's breath hitched. Her scientific mind, a drowning victim clawing for a piece of driftwood, supplied a dozen rational explanations: auditory processing errors under stress, labyrinthine vertigo, subtle seismic shifts. But her body knew better. The fine hairs on her arms stood on end. A primal instinct, honed over millennia of evolution to detect predators in the dark, screamed that they were not alone. The nothingness had a presence. "Keenan," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "What was that?" "It is not a what," he replied, his own voice unnervingly calm. "It is the echo. It notices us." Before she could ask what he meant, a new sensation began. A low-frequency vibration, not in the air, but in the rock beneath her feet. It rose slowly, a deep, subsonic thrum that resonated in her bones, her teeth, her very skull. It was a sound that existed below the threshold of hearing, a silent roar. With the vibration came a change in temperature. A profound, piercing cold that had nothing to do with the ambient air. It was a leeching cold. A cold that pulled warmth from her body with a physical, tactile pressure. She could feel the heat draining from her face, her hands, her core. It was the cold of absolute zero, the cold of a universe where the last star has died. "The walls," Alara gasped, her words clouding in front of her face, though she couldn't see them. The handprints, they weren't burned. They were frozen. They hadn't been pressing their hands to the wall in pain. They had been trying to draw warmth from it, a desperate, final act against this encroaching, absolute cold. The silent thrum intensified. The space around them began to feel viscous. Elara tried to take a step back and her boot met a strange resistance, as if she were wading through unseen water. The very fabric of space was thickening, warping around them. "We have to go back," she said, the words a desperate struggle against the rising tide of terror. "Now." "There is no back," Keenan's voice was tight, strained. "Only through." He was right. Turning back into that spiraling shaft of inverted physics now seemed like an even greater madness. The path he had revealed, the hidden passage, was their only hope. And it lay on the other side of whatever chamber this was. Then, a new light appeared. It wasn't from a lamp. It was a faint, sickly luminescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A pale, phosphorescent green, the color of deep-sea decay. In the growing light, the chamber took shape around them. They were in a vast, circular room. Its walls were not smooth but lined with what looked like thousands of metallic, book-like plates, slotted into vertical niches from floor to ceiling. A library. A library of impossible knowledge. The chaotic, frantic etchings on the plates pulsed with the eerie green light. Elara, her mind now a strange cocktail of terror and insatiable curiosity, found her eyes drawn to a series of symbols near the entrance. They were simpler, more pictorial. They told a story. The first showed the sun and moon in balance over a diagram of the earth. The second showed figures, the smiths, the alchemists, driving a metallic object, a seed, into the earth's core. The third showed the earth convulsing. Lines of energy spiraling from the seed. The fourth showed the smiths building their city downwards, chasing the energy, containing it. The final image was chilling. It showed the central chamber, a sphere, with the figures inside it not celebrating, but recoiling in horror from a black, empty blotch at its center. They had not been trying to achieve enlightenment. They had been trying to perform surgery on the planet. And something had gone terribly wrong. This was their laboratory, Elara breathed. And their prison. The thrumming vibration reached a crescendo, and the green light flared. In the center of the library, the empty space began to shimmer, like heat haze off a summer road. The air distorted, folded in on itself. A single point of darkness appeared, no bigger than a pinprick, and then rapidly expanded. It was a sphere of perfect, absolute blackness, a hole in the world, absorbing the sickly green light, absorbing the very idea of illumination. The silent echo had a face. Elara felt her sanity fraying at the edges. This was the source of the paradox. The radiation sink. The temporal distortion. The gravitational anomaly. A localized singularity, a stable pocket of anti-creation. As the black sphere grew to the size of a man, the metal plates in the library began to rattle in their niches. A new sound entered the chamber, the first true sound she had heard in what felt like hours, a high, thin, metallic screaming. The sound of atoms being torn apart. "It is waking up," Keenan said, his voice grim. "The seal is broken. It knows it can be free." The black sphere pulsed. With each pulse, the leeching cold intensified, and the world seemed to warp at its edges. Elara saw the far wall of the library ripple, as if it were a tapestry shaking in the wind. This wasn't just a passive anomaly anymore. It was active. It was hunting. "The escape route, Keenan," she yelled, the sound of her own voice a shocking intrusion. "Where is it?" He pointed towards the other side of the vast, circular room. "Through there. A service conduit. The stories call it the Smith's breath. To get there, they would have to pass the sphere." They began to move, hugging the curved wall, the metallic plates screaming their high, thin song around them. The floor felt unsteady, pitching like the deck of a ship in a storm. Elara kept her eyes locked on the passage, refusing to look at the sphere. But she could feel its presence, a cold, vast intelligence that was utterly alien. It was not malevolent. It was simply, other. And its otherness was inimical to her existence. Halfway across the room, one of the metal plates shot out of its niche, propelled by an unseen force. It flew past Elara's head, missing her by inches, and struck the sphere. There was no clang of impact. The plate simply vanished. It didn't shatter, it was unwritten from reality, its matter and energy consumed without a trace. "Don't let it touch you," Keenan warned. His voice low and urgent. They scrambled faster, their movements clumsy in the warping space. Elara risked a glance at the sphere. Its surface was not smooth, it was a roiling, churning void. And within its depths, she saw something. Not a reflection. A memory. She saw the cave. She saw the rockfall, the dust, the darkness. She saw her colleague, Mark, his leg pinned, his face pale in the beam of her lamp. And she heard his last words again, not as a memory, but as if he were whispering in her ear right now. It's okay, Elara. You'll get out. Just, tell them what we found. The sphere was showing her the source of her trauma, the memory she had entombed in logic. It was feeding on it. Using it. A wave of pure, incandescent rage surged through her, momentarily burning away the fear. "No," she snarled at the void. "You don't get that. That's mine." She reached the far side of the chamber, stumbling into the dark maw of the service conduit. It was a narrow, cylindrical tunnel, barely wide enough to stand in, mercifully free of the chaotic energies of the library. Keenan was right behind her. They paused, gasping for breath, their backs pressed against the cold metal. Looking back, they could see the sphere pulsing faster. The entire library now shaking violently. "It will not stay in that room for long," Keenan said. "The containment is failing." Elara's mind, fueled by adrenaline and rage, began to work again. She wasn't a victim in a cave anymore. She was a scientist. And this was the ultimate problem to be solved. She pulled up the schematics on her wrist console. The screen was flickering, the image distorting, but it was still functional. She saw their position. She saw the library. And she saw the levels below it. The chaotic etchings, the frantic handprints, they hadn't been trying to contain the sphere in the library. The library was just an antechamber. A diagnostic room. The real prison, the crucible itself, was deeper. "The story isn't over, Keenan," she said, her voice hard. They took it deeper. "There's one more level." Keenan's face, illuminated by the flickering console, was grim. "That is not a level, Elara. That is the end. The legends say it is the place the Smiths forged the first silence. No one who went down ever came back." "They didn't have a reason to come back," Elara said, a wild, desperate plan forming in her mind. "They were trying to study it. To control it. They failed. We're not going to study it. We're going to bury it." She pointed a shaking finger at the schematic. "This conduit doesn't just go up. It branches. One path leads to the surface. The other leads down. To the core chamber. And there are pressure release junctions all along the way. They were designed to vent energy." "Vent it where?" "Outwards," she said, her eyes wide with the terrifying brilliance of the idea. "They're not for releasing pressure. They're for creating it. They're demolition charges. Keenan, they built a dead man's switch. They built a way to collapse the entire core on top of itself. It was an act of ultimate desperation. An act of scientific sacrifice. A choice so profound it bordered on myth. We can't leave it like this," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound, terrible certainty. "We can't let that thing reach the surface. We have to go down. We have to finish their work. Keenan stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the chaotic light. He saw no longer the arrogant, dismissive scientist, but a woman stripped bare to her core, her fear forged into a weapon. He saw the same desperate resolve he had only ever read about in the legends of the Keepers. He gave a single, slow nod. The descent into the final conduit was a journey through the bowels of a dying machine. The silent thrumming was now a constant, nauseating vibration. The air grew colder still, so cold that Alara's exposed skin felt tight and brittle. The only light came from her flickering console, casting their shadows long and skeletal against the curved walls. The conduit was not designed for human passage. It was a maintenance shaft, barely a meter in diameter, forcing them to crouch and shuffle. Every few hundred feet, they passed one of the junctions Alara had seen on the schematic. They were alcoves containing a metallic panel covered in the same alchemical script. A single, large, hand-shaped indentation was pressed into the center of each panel. "These are the triggers," Alara said, her voice hushed. She ran her glove over one of the handprints. It was freezing cold. "It needs a catalyst. A biosignature. Heat." They had to press their own hands to it to start the chain reaction. A chain reaction. A controlled demolition designed to bring millions of tons of rock down upon the core. A final, desperate act of containment. "There are 3 junctions," she traced the path on her console. "And then the core chamber itself. The sequence has to be initiated from the core and then triggered at each junction on the way out. It's a relay. One person can't do it. It needs 2. Keenan looked at the handprint. Then at her. The unspoken question hung in the freezing air between them. Who would go to the core? "I have to be the one," Alara said, her voice firm. "I'm the only one who can read the primary initiation sequence. You have to wait at the first junction. When you see the energy pulse through the conduit walls, you press the panel. Then you run for the exit shaft. I'll trigger the next 2 on my way out behind you." It was a flimsy plan. A prayer whispered in the face of oblivion, and they both knew it. "Alara," Keenan began, but she cut him off. "There's no time for debate. This thing is tearing its prison apart. We have maybe 30 minutes before the entire structure fails." She met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a feverish light. "You said your legends were warnings. This is me heeding them. Now, show me the way." The final length of the conduit opened into a space that defied description. They were on a narrow causeway, a bridge of the same dark metal, hanging in a void. Below them, above them, all around them, was the core chamber. It was a perfect sphere, hundreds of feet in diameter. And it was full of the silent echo. The black, roiling sphere from the library was here, but it was immense, a sun of antimatter that filled a third of the chamber. It did not radiate darkness, it was the physical incarnation of it. Around it, space itself buckled. Alara saw glimpses of other places in the shimmering distortions, a flash of a desert under a purple sun, a forest of crystalline trees, a sky full of alien constellations. The chamber was a window into every reality, all collapsing into the central void. In the center of the causeway was a raised dais, a control pulpit. This was the heart of the machine. The place where the first smiths had stood. Alara took a deep breath, the freezing air searing her lungs, and started walking. Each step felt like a betrayal of every survival instinct she possessed. The causeway vibrated violently under her feet. The silent roar of the void was a physical pressure, threatening to crush her. She reached the dais. The control panel was a swirl of etched, glowing lines. In the center was a handprint, larger than the others, glowing with a faint, residual heat. This was the primary trigger. She looked back at Keenan, a silhouette at the entrance to the conduit. She gave him a sharp nod. "Go." He disappeared into the tunnel. She was alone. She placed her hand over the glowing print. The console flared to life, the alchemical symbols swirling around her hand. For a moment, her mind connected with the machine. She felt the sheer, terrifying intellect of its creators. Their ambition, their hubris, and their ultimate, crushing despair. She felt the void they had unleashed, an intelligent, hungry emptiness. And she felt their last, desperate hope, a belief that someone, someday, would have the courage to finish what they started. She took another breath and pushed her hand down. The moment her palm made contact, the universe screamed. Not in sound, but in pure, unadulterated information. A torrent of it flooded Alara's mind, the birth of stars, the geometry of folded space, the lament of dying galaxies, the cold, patient thoughts of the void itself. It was the knowledge of the keepers, the sum of their terrible discovery, and it was too much for a human mind to hold. Her vision dissolved into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. The scar on her forehead burned with a white-hot agony. She felt her consciousness shredding, her identity being unwritten by the cosmic torrent. But amidst the chaos, one image held firm, Mark's face in the darkness of the cave. His final, trusting gaze. "Tell them what we found." She wasn't just sealing a tomb to save herself. She was keeping a promise. With a primal scream that had no sound, she focused all of her will, all of her being, into a single, defiant thought, no. The torrent of information receded, repelled by the simple, stubborn anchor of her humanity. The light show in her vision collapsed back into a single point, the glowing console under her hand. A new symbol pulsed on the screen, a simple, straight line. The sequence was initiated. The energy was released. A wave of pure white light, silent and absolute, erupted from the dais and shot up the conduit she had just left. It was the signal. The first domino had fallen. Now, she had to run. She tore her hand away from the panel and sprinted back down the causeway. The sphere of nothingness pulsed violently, as if in anger, and a tendril of darkness lashed out, narrowly missing the bridge she was on. The section of metal it touched simply ceased to be, leaving a gaping hole. The causeway was disintegrating behind her. She threw herself into the mouth of the conduit just as another tendril erased the dais she had been standing on. She scrambled through the dark, narrow tube, her body screaming in protest, fueled by pure adrenaline. The walls of the conduit now glowed with the white energy of the trigger sequence, a river of light flowing ahead of her. She reached the first junction. Keenan was gone. In the center of the panel, his handprint was seared into the metal, glowing cherry red. He had done his part. The second junction was 500 meters further. It felt like miles. The vibrations were so intense now that she could barely stay on her feet. The structure was coming apart. Chunks of the metallic ceiling rained down. A piece glanced off her shoulder, sending a shock of pain down her arm. She ignored it. She saw the second alcove ahead. She didn't slow down. As she passed, she slammed her palm against the trigger panel. The searing heat was immense. But she barely felt it through the adrenaline. A second wave of energy pulsed ahead of her, joining the first. 2 down. 1 to go. The final junction was near the exit shaft. It was the fail-safe, the final trigger that would begin the core collapse. As she ran, the pure white light in the conduit began to flicker, turning a chaotic, angry red. The containment was failing faster than she had anticipated. The void was fighting back. She saw the final alcove. And she saw Keenan. He was standing there, waiting for her. "Keenan, what are you doing?" she screamed, her voice raw. "You were supposed to go." "The mechanism is damaged," he shouted back over the roar of the disintegrating structure. He pointed to the panel. A deep crack ran through the handprint sensor. "It needs more energy. A steady contact. It will not trigger with just a touch." Someone had to hold their hand to the panel until the sequence was complete. It was a suicide mission. "Then I'll do it," Alara said, moving towards him. He put a hand on her chest, stopping her. His calm was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. "No. You are the one who must tell the story. Even if it is only to yourself. You are the keeper now. Keenan. Don't. My grandmother used to say, he said, a sad smile touching his lips, that a man's purpose is to find the story he was born to finish. He turned and placed his hand firmly on the cracked panel. The red light of the conduit converged on the panel, on him. He was engulfed in a blinding torrent of energy. He did not scream. His body simply dissolved into light, his final, defiant act of courage the catalyst for the entire collapse. The floor beneath Alara gave way. She was falling. The fall was blessedly short. She landed hard on the ramp of the exit shaft, the impact jarring every bone in her body. The shaft was angled steeply upwards, a chute leading to the surface. The entire world was a symphony of destruction, the groan of tortured metal and the shriek of shearing rock. But above it all, she could feel a new, deeper vibration, the slow, inexorable collapse of the core. Keenan's sacrifice had worked. She clawed her way up the ramp, her body a single, screaming nerve of pain. The light from the collapsing core pulsed behind her, casting her shadow long and fleeing before her. It was a race against the mountain itself. She could hear the roar of the implosion chasing her, a wave of absolute destruction swallowing the impossible city level by level. The air grew warmer, dustier. She could smell the surface. She could smell life. She scrambled faster, her nails tearing against the rough-hewn rock of the escape tunnel. The clean, machined angles of the Keeper's city were gone, replaced by the natural chaos of a simple cave. She saw a pinprick of light. The exit. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she pulled herself over a ledge and collapsed onto the dusty floor of a small, forgotten cave, the kind that dotted the Cappadocian landscape by the thousand. She rolled onto her back, gasping, her lungs burning, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and shock. The ground shook one last time, a deep, final shudder that seemed to pass through the entire planet. And then, silence. A normal silence. The gentle silence of the wind whistling through the rocks. The distant cry of a hawk. She was out. She was alive. She lay there for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the single shaft of evening sunlight that pierced the cave's gloom. It was over. The city, the silent echo, Keenan, all of it was gone, buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock and sealed by the sacrifice of a man whose name history would never know. She looked at her hands. They were scraped and bleeding. Her left palm was burned. The skin red and blistered where she had slammed it against the trigger panel. A scar. A story. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet. She checked her equipment. Her wrist console was dead, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. The personal recorder on her belt was gone, torn away in the chaos. Her sensors, her data logs, her spectral analyses, all of it was dust. She had no proof. Not a single shred of evidence to support the impossible truth she now carried. She thought of her career, of her reputation as a hard-nosed empiricist. She pictured herself standing before a panel of her peers, trying to explain a time-dilating, gravity-warping, sentient void and the alchemical machine built to contain it. They would think she had gone mad. The trauma of the near-death experience, they would say. A psychotic break. She stumbled out of the cave and into the twilight. The Cappadocian Valley spread before her, its fairy chimneys painted orange and purple by the setting sun. It was the most beautiful, most normal sight she had ever seen. In the distance, she could see the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles at the main dig site. To them, this was a tragedy. A sudden, inexplicable seismic event that had destroyed a priceless archaeological find and claimed the lives of her team. They would search for bodies that no longer existed in any conventional sense. She was a ghost, a survivor of a catastrophe no one could ever understand. Keenan's final words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, you are the one who must tell the story. Even if it is only to yourself, asterisk. He hadn't meant a story for the history books or the scientific journals. He had meant a truth to be guarded. She was not just a scientist anymore. She was a keeper. The walk back to the camp was a blur. She was found by a frantic search party, wrapped in a thermal blanket, and hurried to the medical tent. She answered their questions with a curated, exhausted honesty. There was a tremor. The structure was unstable. It all happened so fast. She didn't know what caused it. She was lucky to have found an old escape shaft. She was the only one. The lie was heavy, but it was a shield. A shield for the world against a truth it was not ready for. Weeks later, Elara sat in a sterile, white office at the university, the air smelling of floor polish and academic pressure. Across the polished mahogany desk, Dr. Eris Thorne and a panel of 3 other somber-faced academics looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "So, to be clear, Dr. Vance," Thorne said. Folding his hands, "it is your official conclusion that the structural failure was due to previously undetected tectonic stresses and that all data from the primary chambers was lost in the subsequent collapse." Elara met his gaze. Her hands were steady in her lap. The burn on her palm had healed into a pale, smooth scar, a secret she would carry forever. "That is correct. The geological pressures at that depth were far greater than our preliminary surveys indicated. The entire inner structure was a house of cards. It is my recommendation that the site be declared permanently unstable and sealed under international treaty. No further exploration should be attempted. It is simply too dangerous." It was a masterful report, a labyrinth of geological jargon and cautious speculation that said everything and nothing. It created a conclusion that was scientifically plausible, professionally defensible, and a complete and utter fabrication. It was the best, most important lie she would ever tell. One of the panel members, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Ito, leaned forward. "And the alloy, Dr. Vance?" "The door. Your initial report spoke of a composition that was." "My initial reports were written before a proper calibration could be performed in a controlled environment," Elara cut in smoothly, her voice betraying no emotion. "Given the extreme electromagnetic interference we experienced, I can no longer stand by that preliminary data. It was, in all likelihood, a highly complex but naturally occurring meteoric iron composite, fused into the tuff by some ancient geothermal event. It was a weak explanation, and she knew it. But it was an explanation they could accept, one that fit within their worldview. A geological anomaly was infinitely more palatable than an alchemical one." Thorne sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "The discovery of a lifetime, gone. Very well, Doctor. Your recommendation will be forwarded to the International Commission. Thank you for your report. And, for your bravery." She was dismissed. As she walked out of the office, she felt the weight of their judgment. They didn't believe her. Not really. They would whisper about it for years. Vance's folly. The woman who cracked under pressure, lost her team, and came back with a story of geological convenience. Her career as a field-leading researcher was over. She had chosen truth over facts, and the world of facts would never forgive her. She didn't care. She had traded her ambition for something far more valuable, a secret kept. She had looked into the abyss. And instead of letting it consume her, she had helped to wall it up. She had become, in her own small way, a smith who hammered the silence. The final scene of her old life was packing up her office. The academic papers, the geological maps, the metallurgical charts, they all seemed like artifacts from another civilization, the relics of a person she no longer was. She paused at a framed photo on her desk. It was of her and Mark, young and smiling, taken on the day they received their doctorates. She traced his face with her finger. "I told them, Mark," she thought. Asterisk, "I just didn't use words." Asterisk. She left the photo on the desk. That part of her story was over. Months later, the world had moved on. The Derinkuyu incident was a footnote, a tragic but ultimately minor event in the grand scheme of archaeological exploration. Elara Vance had taken an extended leave of absence from the university, citing post-traumatic stress. It was not untrue. She returned to Turkey, not as a scientist, but as a pilgrim. She moved through the landscape of Cappadocia, a ghost in the tourist crowds. She watched the hot air balloons rise at dawn, silent and majestic against the pink sky. She walked among the fairy chimneys, her boots kicking up the same dust as generations before her. But she saw it all with new eyes. She saw not just geology, but a monument. Not just a valley, but a tombstone. A beautiful, sun-drenched tombstone for a secret buried in the cold, silent dark. She found her way to a small, quiet cafe in Gorim, one tucked away from the main streets, a place where old men sat for hours, nursing small, tulip-shaped glasses of tea. She sat at an outdoor table, the sun warm on her face. She didn't have to wait long. Kenan Demir walked up to her table and sat down without a word, placing 2 glasses of steaming, amber tea between them. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze was as steady as the ancient rock around them. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the world go by. There were no questions about the report, no discussion of the panel. No mention of what lay buried beneath their feet. There was no need. Their shared experience was a language that required no words. Finally, Elara spoke, her voice quiet. "Your grandmother, what else did she used to say?" Kenan took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes on the horizon. "She used to say that the most important stories are the ones that are never told. They are the ones you carry inside you. They are what give the world its weight." Elara looked down at her own hand, at the pale, smooth scar on her palm. It no longer felt like a brand of trauma, but a mark of purpose. It was the weight she now carried. She was a wise woman, Elara said. She knew how to listen to the silence, he replied. He looked at her then, a small, sad, but genuine smile touching his lips. "Some stars, Elara," he said softly, "are more beautiful when they remain in the sky. Unseen. It is the knowing they are there that matters." She met his smile with one of her own. For the first time since the cave, since Mark, a sense of peace settled over her. Her old life of certainty and ambition was gone, burned away in the crucible of the core chamber. She had lost her career. She had lost her footing in the world of facts. But she had found something else. A humbling, terrifying, and ultimately profound understanding that the universe was so much larger, stranger, and more wondrous than she had ever allowed herself to believe. She had traded her knowledge for wisdom. She picked up her glass of tea. The warmth spread through her fingers, a simple, real, physical sensation. A law of thermodynamics she could trust. She took a sip, the sweet, strong flavor grounding her. The story was safe. The silence was kept. And in the quiet heart of Anatolia, a new keeper watched over a sleeping, star-swallowing city, her vigil marked only by the silent rising of the sun. Story 2. Does the mist have a memory? Anya often thought so. It clung to the ancient oaks of the grove with a possessiveness that felt older than Rome, older than the Iceni kings, older even than the bronze axes that had first cleared paths through the forest. It was a breathing thing, tasting of damp earth, rotted leaves, and the cold iron tang of the nearby fens. On mornings like this, when the sun was a weak, milky smudge behind a veil of gray, the mist was the world. It muffled the sounds of the village, the distant bleating of goats, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and left only the whisper of her own breath and the soft scuff of her leather boots on the mossy ground. Her fingers, stained with the faint green of crushed herbs, traced the spiraling lines of a triskele carved into the bark of the oldest oak, the heartwood. This was her sanctuary, her library. Not of scrolls and ink, but of roots, leaves, and bark. She was a healer, a keeper of the old ways taught to her by her mother, Morwen, the village priestess. Her knowledge was not in words but in textures, in scents, in the precise way a yarrow leaf must be bruised to draw out a fever. A faint, spiraling birthmark on her wrist, a perfect mirror of the carving on the tree, tingled with the chill air. A mark of connection, Morwen had always said. A sign that the forest knew her. Today, the peace felt thin, fragile as a dragonfly's wing. For 10 years, the black eagle of Rome had nested at the edge of their lands. At first, they were a distant dread, a story told by traders of legions and iron discipline. Then came the road, a merciless white scar sliced through the wilderness. Then the fort, a grim, square-jawed intrusion on a nearby hill. And with the fort came the prefect, Tiberius Quintus. He was not a soldier like his predecessor, a man of brutal but understandable violence. Quintus was a man of ledgers and laws, a different kind of predator. He bled them not with swords but with taxes, his demands for grain and silver as relentless and consuming as a winter blight. An unnatural sound broke the morning's quiet. Not the clean ring of a woodsman's axe, but a grating, rhythmic clang, accompanied by the strained braying of mules and the harsh shouts of men speaking the clipped, foreign tongue of Latin. Anya's heart seized. She crept to the edge of the grove, peering through a screen of ferns. There, at the edge of the sacred ground, stood a small contingent of Roman soldiers, their red cloaks a violent slash of color against the green. With them was a man in a clean, white toga, Quintus. Beside him, a younger Roman with a perpetually worried expression, Marcus Vipsanius, his scribe, clutched a wax tablet. But it was the other figures that made Anya's blood run cold. A dozen local men, gaunt-faced and hollow-eyed, were being forced to haul survey equipment under the watch of the legionaries. Their own people, conscripted to measure their own desecration. Quintus pointed a dismissive finger directly at the heartwood oak. "This is the center," he declared, his voice devoid of any emotion save impatience. "The surveyors confirm it. The timber from this grove alone will suffice for the new barracks and the villa's foundation. The rest can be cleared for farmland. Productive. Efficient." Marcus, the scribe, swallowed hard. "Prefect," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "the locals, they consider this grove sacred. The priestess. Especially. To fell these trees would be a profound insult." Quintus turned a look on him so cold it could have frozen the mist. "An insult to whom, Vipsanius?" "A collection of superstitious barbarians who think gods live in trees. Their sentiment is not a factor in our resource allocation. This land belongs to the emperor. It will be used for the good of the empire. Mark the boundaries. I want the felling to begin by noon." As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the heart of the grove. Morwen. Her hair was a wild mane of silver, her face a road map of wrinkles, but her eyes burned with a fire that had not dimmed with age. She held no weapon, only a staff of twisted oak. She stopped before Quintus, her presence seeming to make the very air grow still. "This land does not belong to your emperor, Roman," Morwen said, her voice low but carrying with the weight of generations. "It belongs to the gods of this place. You will not touch these trees." Quintus offered a thin, cruel smile. "I admire your conviction, old woman. But your gods are silent, and my axes are sharp. Stand aside." "You do not understand," Morwen said, planting her staff firmly in the earth. "To cut the heartwood is to sever our roots. To kill our memory. We are the land, and the land is us. If you strike it, you strike us." "A quaint notion," Quintus replied, his patience wearing thin. He gestured to 2 of his soldiers. "Remove her." Anya's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror she had never known. The soldiers moved forward, their faces impassive. Morwen did not flinch. As they reached for her, she raised her staff and began to chant. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to hum from the ground itself. It was a song of binding, of protection. For a moment, the soldiers hesitated. The air grew heavy, charged with something ancient and unseen. Quintus's face tightened. This was not simple defiance, it was a display of power he could not quantify, and therefore could not tolerate. "I said, "Remove her," he snarled. One of the soldiers, emboldened by his prefect's fury, lunged forward. He did not simply grab her arm. He swung the butt of his pilum in a short, brutal arc. The sound was a sickening crunch, like a branch snapping underfoot. Morwen crumpled to the ground without a sound. The chanting stopped. The air went silent. Time seemed to stop. Anya saw it all with a horrifying clarity, her mother's silver hair spilling into the mud. The dark stain spreading from the back of her head, the look of shock and dawning horror on Marcus's face, the utter indifference in the eyes of Quintus as he turned back to his plans. He gestured to the conscripted villagers. An example has been made. Work. The world, which had frozen, now shattered. A scream tore from Anya's throat, a sound of pure, animalistic agony. It was a sound she did not recognize as her own. It ripped through the mist, carrying not just grief, but a promise. The soldiers turned, startled, searching for the source. But Anya was already gone, melting back into the forest she knew better than her own skin. As she ran, the triskill on her wrist burned, not with a chill, but with a searing heat. The calm blue glow of her life was extinguished, and in its place, a furious, vengeful crimson began to burn. The forest had seen. And the forest would remember. Grief was a physical thing, a cold stone in her belly. For 2 days, Anya did not eat or sleep. She hid in a small, moss-lined cave behind a waterfall, a place her mother had shown her as a child. The roar of the water was a constant lament, drowning out the memory of that sickening crunch, but it could not wash away the image of Morwen's body lying broken at the foot of the heartwood. The felling had begun. The rhythmic thud of Roman axes echoed through the valley, each blow a fresh wound in Anya's soul. They had not even allowed the villagers to claim her mother's body, leaving it there as a warning. On the 3rd day, the grief began to change. The cold stone at her core began to heat, fueled by the ceaseless, percussive sound of destruction. It was the sound of her world being unmade. The sorrow did not lessen, but it was joined by something else, something sharp and hard as flint, rage. It was a righteous fury that burned away her tears and her fear, leaving behind a terrifying clarity. Her mother had said, "If you strike the land, you strike us." Quintus had struck. Now, the land would strike back. She emerged from the cave, her face pale and taut, her eyes burning with a new, dangerous light. The crimson spiral on her wrist was a constant, dull throb. She was no longer just a healer. The forest had lost its priestess, now it had an avenger. Her first stop was the village, but she did not enter. She watched from the shadows as Roman patrols moved through the streets, their presence a suffocating weight. The villagers moved with their heads down, their spirits as broken as their priestess. Words would not unite them now. Fear was too deep. They needed a sign. They needed to see that Rome could bleed. She slipped away, moving through the dense undergrowth towards the Roman road. She knew this land. Quintus and his soldiers knew only the paths they had carved. They did not know the treacherous bogs hidden beneath a carpet of green, or the patches of nightshade and wolfsbane that grew in the dark hollows, or the brittle branches of the old whitethorn trees that could be made to fall with a single, well-placed cut. Her first target was a supply cart, a lumbering wagon pulled by 2 stout mules, carrying provisions to the fort. It was guarded by only 2 legionaries, their pace lazy, their conversation loud in the quiet woods. They were complacent. Arrogant. Anya watched them from a ridge above the road. She had spent hours preparing. She had gathered a large pouch of ground glass fungus, a pale, brittle mushroom that grew on rotted oak. When crushed, it became a fine, almost invisible powder of microscopic, razor-sharp shards. It was a potent irritant, causing temporary blindness and excruciating pain if it got in the eyes. As the cart passed below, she released the powder into the wind. It drifted down like a malign dust. The soldiers walked right into it. The effect was immediate. They cried out, dropping their spears to claw at their eyes. The mules, spooked by the sudden commotion, reared and bolted, snapping the harness and sending the cart crashing into a ditch, its contents spilling across the road. Anya did not wait to see more. She was gone, a ghost in the trees. It was a small victory, a pinprick. But back in the village, the story would be told. The overturned cart, the blinded soldiers, the lost supplies. It would be whispered that the spirits of the forest were angry. It was a start. Her second act required more patience. She found the small, unguarded aqueduct that piped fresh water from a mountain stream directly into the fort. For days, she watched it, learning the patrol schedules. Then, one moonless night, she went to work. She carried with her a bundle of bog nettle roots. They were harmless to touch, but when left to steep in water, they released a sap that caused severe, debilitating stomach cramps. It wouldn't kill, but it would make a legion of soldiers miserable and weak. She found a covered reservoir tank along the aqueduct's path and dropped the bundle inside. The next day, she sought out Donal, the old druid. He had been Morwen's confidant, a man whose wisdom ran as deep as the roots of the trees Quintus was felling. She found him in a hidden clearing, tending to the last few sacred stones the Romans had not yet found. He was frail, his back bent like an old yew, but his eyes were as clear and sharp as a winter sky. "They have taken the grove, Donal," Anya said, her voice raw. "They murdered my mother." Donal nodded slowly, his face a mask of sorrow. "I felt her spirit pass. It was a tear in the fabric of the world." He looked at Anya, truly looked at her, and saw the change. He saw the fire behind her eyes, the crimson throb on her wrist. "Revenge is a poisoned cup, child. It burns the one who drinks it. Grief is a slow poison," Anya countered. "Fear is a cage. I will not die slowly in a cage of their making. I will show our people that the bars can be broken." She told him what she had done. The cart, the water supply. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "You are using the old knowledge as a weapon," he said, his voice heavy. "Your mother taught you to heal. This is the opposite path." "The body fights a fever by burning," Anya replied. "The forest is sick. It needs a fire to cleanse it." From the shadows of the clearing stepped a young man. His face taut with anger, a jagged scar running down his cheek. It was Cadan, a warrior whose family had lost their farm to Roman taxes and who now led a small, angry band of dispossessed youths. He had heard their exchange. "The druid speaks of paths. I speak of swords," Cadan said, his hand resting on the hilt of his short blade. "The girl has the right of it. Words and prayers did not save her mother. My father wasted away in a Roman labor camp. We need blood, not whispers." He looked at Anya, a new respect in his eyes. "You have shown them fear. But pinpricks are not enough. We need to strike a blow they cannot ignore." Anya looked from the cautious druid to the fiery warrior. They were the two halves of her people's heart, one that sought to preserve the past, the other desperate to forge a future. And she, somehow, stood between them. Just then, a cry went up from the village. A runner, breathless and terrified, stumbled into the clearing. "The prefect is furious," he gasped. "Half the garrison is sick from the water. He has ordered the arrest of 10 village elders. He says they will be flogged in the morning as reprisal unless the saboteur is turned over." Donal's face went pale. Cadan's hand tightened on his sword. Anya looked at them both, the weight of a dozen lives settling on her shoulders. Her small acts of defiance had just raised the stakes to a terrifying new level. Quintus was not just a bureaucrat. He was a Roman. And Rome did not tolerate defiance. It crushed it. The news struck Anya like a physical blow. 10 elders. Men and women who had watched her grow, who had shared stories by the fire and blessed the harvests. Their faces flashed before her eyes, old Alara with her kind, crinkled smile, Finn, the storyteller, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. They were to be beaten for her actions. The righteous fire of her rage was suddenly choked by a cold wave of guilt. Donal was right. The poisoned cup was already burning her. "This is what I warned of," Donal said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "You prod the hornet's nest, and the whole village gets stung. So we do nothing." Cadan shot back, his face a mask of fury. "We let them flog our elders. We hand the girl over to be crucified. Is that your wisdom, old man? To bow our heads lower and pray the boot on our neck doesn't press so hard?" "There are other ways," Donal insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Ways of endurance. Of memory." "Memory won't save them now," Anya said, her voice cutting through their argument. She looked at the terrified runner. "Where are they holding them?" "In the half-finished stockade at the new fort," the runner stammered. "They're doubling the guards." Anya's mind raced. Turning herself in was not an option. Quintus would make an example of her, a slow, public death that would terrorize the village into total submission. And he would likely flog the elders anyway. No. The only path forward was the one she had already started down, but now she had to walk it faster, bolder. She had to escalate. "We can't fight a garrison head-on," Cadan said, the anger in his voice now tempered by a grim reality. "My band is barely 20 strong. We have blades and bows, nothing more. We won't fight them head-on," Anya said, a desperate plan forming in her mind. She turned to Donal. "The knowledge you hold, the old ways, are there poisons that are faster than the bog nettle? Something that can incapacitate, but not kill?" Donal looked at her, his face etched with conflict. This was the precipice. To help her now was to fully embrace this path of violence. He thought of Morwen, of her fierce love for her people and her traditions. He saw the same fire in her daughter's eyes. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. "There is the dust of the moonmotha's wing. It induces a deep, sudden sleep. But it is rare. And difficult to handle." "And you, Cadan," Anya said, turning to the warrior. "Your men are fast. They know the woods." "We were born in them," he replied. "Then here is the plan," Anya began, her voice low and urgent. She spoke of diversions, of shadows, of using the Romans' own arrogance against them. She would use Donal's sleeping powder on the night guard's wine. Cadan and his men would create a diversion, a fire at the far end of the logging camp, to draw the main patrols away from the fort. And she would go in herself. She was the smallest, the quietest. She knew the layout of the fort's construction from her long days of watching. It was a fool's plan, a desperate gamble. But as she spoke, the fear in the runner's eyes was replaced by a flicker of hope. Cadan's grim frustration morphed into focused determination. Even Donal seemed to stand a little straighter. For the first time since Morwen's death, they were not just victims reacting to Roman cruelty. They were fighting back. That night, a strange tension settled over the region. Within the fort, the Roman scribe, Marcus Vipsanius, felt it. He watched Prefect Quintus oversee the preparations for the flogging with a chilling detachment, as if planning a public festival. Marcus's stomach churned. He had joined the provincial service believing in the Roman mission, to bring law, order, and civilization to the savage frontiers. But there was no law in Quintus's actions, only tyranny. There was no civilization in the felling of a sacred place, only greed. He thought of the old priestess's eyes, filled not with fear, but with a profound, pitying sorrow for what Quintus was about to unleash. He was rereading Quintus's daily logs. Part of his duties was to make fair copies for the official record, when he noticed discrepancies. The grain yields Quintus reported to Rome were 20% lower than the actual tallies Marcus had recorded from the granaries. The prefect was skimming. He was embezzling from the empire itself, likely selling the surplus grain to merchants in Londinium for his own personal profit. The realization hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. Quintus wasn't just cruel, he was corrupt. He was a rot at the heart of the order Marcus had sworn to serve. He carefully set the wax tablet aside, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disgust. Outside the fort. The plan was in motion. Donald had provided the powder, a fine, silvery dust that shimmered in the moonlight. Caden's men, moving like phantoms, had set their fire, a distant orange glow that soon drew shouts and the panicked sound of horns from the fort. As the main patrol clattered out of the gates, another of Caden's men, a young boy acting as a wine seller, offered a free skin to the remaining gate guards as a token of loyalty. The guards, bored and thirsty, accepted gratefully. Anya watched from the darkness, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was wrapped in a cloak the color of night, her face smeared with mud. In a pouch at her belt were herbs to calm the nerves and others to dull the senses of the guard dogs she knew patrolled the inner walls. The crimson mark on her wrist was a hot, insistent pulse. She waited. An hour passed, an eternity. Finally, she saw the gate guards slump against the wall, their heads lolling in a deep, unnatural sleep. It was time. Taking a deep breath, she slipped through the shadows of the gate, a lone, small figure entering the belly of the beast. The air inside smelled of raw timber, stale sweat, and Roman steel. She moved along the unfinished outer wall, keeping to the deepest shadows. Her every sense on fire. The fate of 10 innocent lives rested on her shoulders. The healer had become an infiltrator, her knowledge of nature now a key to unlock a Roman cage. The inside of the fort was a maze of half-finished structures and neat stacks of supplies, all laid out with Roman precision. It was a geometry of conquest forced upon the wild landscape. Anya moved through it like a whisper of the old world. A ghost of the forest Quintus sought to tame. The sleeping powder had done its work on the gate guards, but she knew there were others. She heard the soft padding of a dog and froze behind a stack of barrels. A large mastiff, a brute bred for war, trotted into view, its nose to the ground. Anya's hand went to her pouch. She pulled out a small piece of dried meat she had treated with crushed valerian root. A herb that induced a state of placid contentment in animals. She tossed it a few feet from the dog. The mastiff stopped, sniffed, and devoured the offering in one gulp. A moment later, its aggressive posture softened. It let out a soft whine, lay down, and rested its head on its paws, looking at her with dopey, untroubled eyes. One danger passed. She continued on, her destination the temporary stockade at the center of the compound. The sounds of the diversionary fire were more distant now, but the fort was not empty. She could hear the coarse laughter of soldiers dicing in a barracks building, the clang of a blacksmith making repairs. Each sound was a threat. She reached the stockade. It was a simple cage of sharpened logs, hastily erected. Inside, she could see the huddled shapes of the elders. 2 guards stood at its entrance. Their spears held loosely. They had not drunk the tainted wine. Anya's heart sank. There was no way past them. As she hid, contemplating her next move, a flicker of movement from a nearby administrative building caught her eye. A lone figure emerged, carrying a small lantern. It was Marcus, the scribe. He looked around furtively, his face pale and drawn in the flickering light. He walked not towards the barracks, but towards the stockade. Anya held her breath. Was he coming to gloat? To interrogate them? Marcus approached the guards. The prefect requires a list of the prisoners' names and villages for the morning report, he said, his voice a convincing imitation of bureaucratic authority. The guards, recognizing the prefect's scribe, grunted and stood aside. Marcus entered the stockade, the lantern light illuminating the fearful faces of the elders. Old Finn, the storyteller, looked up at him, his eyes full of defiance. Come to get a good look at us before your master flogs the life from us, Roman. Finn spat. Marcus winced. I am sorry for this, he whispered, his voice so low Anya could barely hear it. This is not justice. He didn't write anything down. Instead, he knelt beside Alara, the storyteller's wife. Are you harmed? Only our dignity, she replied. Her voice steady. Anya saw her chance. This scribe, this Roman with a conscience, was an unexpected key. While the guards were distracted by Marcus's presence, she crept around the back of the stockade. The logs were thick, the lashings tight. But at the rear, one of the stakes had been driven into softer ground. She had noticed it on her earlier surveillance. Using a small, sharp flint knife, she began to saw at the leather bindings holding it in place. It was slow, painstaking work. Every scrape of the flint sounded like a thunderclap in her own ears. Inside the stockade, Marcus was trying to buy her time, engaging the elders in quiet conversation, asking about their families, pretending to take notes. He was risking everything. If Quintus discovered this, he would be flogged alongside them. Finally, with a soft snap, the last binding gave way. Anya pushed the log carefully, creating a narrow gap at the base of the stockade. She let out a soft, bird-like whistle, a signal she and her mother had used in the woods. One of the younger elders heard it and saw the opening. His eyes widened. He alerted the others with a series of silent gestures. One by one, they began to slip out, silent as wraiths, Anya guiding them into the deep shadows. Marcus, seeing what was happening, felt a surge of terror and exhilaration. He kept the guard's attention, dropping his stylus and making a show of looking for it. It was a clumsy, desperate act, but it worked. 9 elders were out. Only Finn remained. He was old and stiff, and the gap was small. As he tried to squeeze through, his cloak caught on a splinter. He grunted in pain. One of the guards turned. What was that? Marcus stood up quickly. He is unwell. The chill, I think. The guard was suspicious. He walked towards the back of the stockade. Anya's blood ran cold. They were out of time. She looked at Kadan's men, hidden at the edge of the woods, waiting for her signal. A direct fight now would mean a slaughter. Then, from the administrative building, a furious shout. Vipsanius! Where is that report? It was Quintus. The guard hesitated, torn between his suspicion and the prefect's summons. The distraction was all Anya needed. With a powerful tug, she pulled Finn free. The last of the elders was safe. She gave a second whistle, the signal for retreat. Marcus, hearing the whistle and Quintus's bellow, made a split-second decision. He left the stockade, walking with feigned calmness back towards the prefect's office, leaving the guards to discover the empty cage. He knew he was walking towards a brutal interrogation, but he had bought the escapee's precious moments. Anya led the elders into the forest, their feet silent on the mossy earth. They melted into the darkness just as the alarm bells began to ring in the fort. Shouts of fury and confusion echoed through the night. They had done it. They had walked into the heart of Roman power and plucked their people from its grasp. It was more than a pinprick. It was a wound. A deep, insulting wound to the pride of Tiberius Quintus. And Anya knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that his retribution would be swift and terrible. Her small, secret war was about to become a very real, very open one. The rage of Tiberius Quintus was a palpable thing, a storm that broke over the village the next day. He did not know who had engineered the escape, but he knew it required collusion. His fury was cold, precise, and systematic. He tripled the grain tax, effective immediately. He decreed that any villager found in the forest without a Roman permit would be arrested for sedition. And he brought Marcus Vipsanius before him. The scribe stood in the prefect's Spartan office, his face bruised from the initial questioning by the guards. Quintus paced before him, his movements like those of a caged wolf. An empty stockade, Vipsanius, Quintus said, his voice dangerously soft. 10 prisoners vanish. And my personal scribe is the last one to see them. Explain this to me. Slowly. I do not know how it happened, Prefect, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. I was taking their names, as you ordered. When I left, they were there. The guards can attest. The guards were fools, Quintus sneered. But you are not a fool. You are an educated man. A Roman. And yet, I have this nagging suspicion that your loyalties are divided. He stopped pacing and stared at Marcus. I have reviewed your work. Your notes on the local flora and fauna, your translations of their nonsensical myths. There is a sympathy there. A weakness. Marcus remained silent. His mind was racing. He thought of the wax tablets in his quarters, the ledgers detailing Quintus's embezzlement. That was his only leverage, his only hope. But to reveal it was to accuse a prefect, a death sentence in itself if he could not prove it. I am loyal to Rome, sir, Marcus said carefully. Rome is order. Rome is strength. Rome is the taming of this wretched, mud-caked wilderness, Quintus said, his voice rising. These people are not noble souls to be sympathized with. They are savages. They understand only force. And they will learn that lesson. You will be confined to your quarters. If I find one shred of evidence that you were involved, I will have you flayed and hung from the fort's walls as a traitor. Dismissed, Marcus returned to his small room, a prisoner in his own home. He knew Quintus would find a scapegoat eventually. His time was running out. Meanwhile, Anya and the rescued elders were hidden deep in the fens, a labyrinth of waterways and reed beds that the Romans feared to enter. The elders, though safe, were shaken. The news of Quintus's reprisals reached them through Cadan's scouts. We have saved 10 to doom 100, old Finn said, his voice heavy with despair. He will starve the village to punish us. Then we will feed them, Anya replied. Her small band, bolstered by Cadan's warriors and other villagers who had fled Quintus's wrath, began to organize. They hunted game in the deep woods, fished in the hidden meres, and raided Roman supply lines with increasing boldness. Anya's knowledge was their greatest asset. She showed them how to use tripwires made of tough vines, how to create disorienting smoke from damp leaves and specific fungi, how to use the terrain as their primary weapon. They became ghosts, a rumor, the wraith of the fens. A cart would be found with its wheels broken and its grain gone. A Roman patrol would get lost in the bogs, emerging days later, exhausted and terrified. Quintus grew more and more furious. The rebellion was not being crushed, it was growing. He could not control the forest, and he could not find its heart. The turning point came with the first snow. The raids became harder, food scarcer for both sides. Quintus knew he had to force a confrontation before winter set in properly. He needed a lure. He needed to strike at something Anya could not afford to lose. His scouts brought him news. The druid, Donal, had been visiting a small, isolated hamlet to the north, a place where many of the escaped elders' families were now hiding. It was a civilian target. A place of no military value. It was perfect. He dispatched a cohort of his best men, not to arrest, but to raise it. To leave nothing but ash. Cadan's scouts brought the news to Anya's camp in the fens. Panic erupted. The hamlet was 2 days' march away. The Romans were already on the move. It's a trap, Donal said, his face grim. He wants to draw us out of the fens, into the open. It doesn't matter, Cadan argued, his hand gripping his sword. There are women and children there. We cannot let them burn. They were caught. To ignore the threat was to abandon their own people, to prove that their rebellion could not protect the innocent. To respond was to walk into Quintus's ambush. Anya felt the weight of the decision press down on her. Her internal battle raged. The healer in her screamed to protect the innocent. The budding strategist knew it was a trap. This was Quintus's genius, he wasn't just fighting her warriors, he was attacking her conscience. We will not walk into his trap, she said finally, her voice clear and decisive, silencing the arguments. But we will not abandon them. She looked at Donal. The paths the Romans use, they follow the high ground, the dry ground. Are there other ways? Old ways? Donal's eyes lit with a flicker of understanding. There is the serpent's path. A treacherous trail through the marshes. It is dangerous, and it will be half flooded with the snowmelt. But it is direct. A journey of 2 days can be made in one, if the spirits of the bog allow it. Then that is our path, Anya declared. Kadan, take 5 of your fastest men. You will move ahead. Do not engage the Romans. Harass them. Slow them down. Make them think our main force is shadowing them. Lead them on. She turned to the others. The rest of us, we take the serpent's path. We will get to the hamlet before the legionaries. We will evacuate the people, and we will prepare a surprise for the prefect's men when they finally arrive. It was a desperate race against time. As her small army prepared to move, she felt a profound sense of dread and determination. She was no longer just raiding supply carts. She was marching to meet a Roman cohort. She was leading her people to war. The crimson mark on her wrist burned, a constant reminder of the fire that had started it all. The fire that would either forge them into a new nation or consume them all in its flames. The serpent's path was a waking nightmare. It was less a path and more a suggestion, a winding trail of slightly firmer ground through the sucking mire of the fens. Icy water, the color of rust, seeped into their boots, chilling them to the bone. A thick, freezing fog clung to the reeds, reducing visibility to a few feet and muffling sound into a disorienting soup. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the hum of insects that even the first snows could not kill. Anya led the way, Donal at her side. The old druid seemed to draw strength from the bleak landscape, reading the bent reeds and the patterns of algae on the water's surface like a map. He guided them around treacherous sinkholes and through channels of deep, slow-moving water. The warriors, some 40 strong, followed in a grim, silent line, their trust in Anya absolute. She was their hope, a living embodiment of the land's defiance. But inside, Anya felt the crushing weight of her command. Every slip of a foot, every shiver that racked a warrior's body, was her responsibility. The healer in her noted the pale faces, the blue-tinged lips, the early signs of exposure. She pushed them onward, her voice sharp and encouraging, while her heart ached with the price they were paying. This was the cost of leadership, to demand sacrifice, to push people past their limits, to know that some might not survive the journey, let alone the battle to come. The crimson spiral on her wrist was a hot, throbbing counterpoint to the cold that seeped into her bones. Meanwhile, Kadan and his small band were playing a deadly game. They shadowed the Roman cohort, a force of nearly 80 disciplined legionaries marching in perfect formation. They were led by a grizzled centurion named Vitellius, a veteran of the German wars who had no patience for the superstitions of this new land. Kadan's men were ghosts in the trees at the edge of the Roman road. They did not show themselves. They shot arrows with burning moss into the supply wagons, forcing the Romans to halt and extinguish the flames. They used slings to hurl stones into the hillsides above the road, creating small rockslides that blocked the path. Vitellius grew increasingly irritated. The attacks were insignificant, pinpricks. Yet they were effective. They broke the legion's marching rhythm, frayed their nerves, and, most importantly, slowed them down. They are like gnats, he spat to his optio. Cowards who will not face us. They follow us, trying to delay the inevitable. He was falling for the feint, convinced he was being shadowed by a larger force waiting for the right moment to strike. He ordered his men to advance in a tighter, more defensive formation, slowing them further. Back on the serpent's path, after a grueling, non-stop march of 20 hours, Anya's force emerged from the fens. They were exhausted, caked in mud, and half-frozen, but they had made it. Before them lay the small, peaceful hamlet, its people still blissfully unaware of the approaching doom. Anya did not allow them to rest. "We evacuate now," she commanded. "Everything you can carry." We move them to the caves in the high rocks. Panic and confusion greeted them, but the sight of the rescued elders among Anya's warriors lent her authority. The evacuation was frantic but swift. Within hours, the hamlet was empty, a ghost town waiting for its executioners. But Anya was not just planning to save the villagers. She was planning to bloody the Romans. "This is where we turn his trap back on him," she told her weary followers, gathering them in the shelter of the caves. She laid out her plan, using her knowledge of the land as her weapon. The path to the hamlet led through a narrow, wooded defile. It was the only viable approach. Anya had her warriors dig pits, filling them with sharpened stakes and covering them with a flimsy lattice of branches and leaves. She had others rig heavy logs to swing down from the hillsides. Her most ingenious trap involved the river that ran alongside the path. Further upstream, her people, under Dunall's direction, built a temporary dam of rocks and logs, causing the water level to drop to a mere trickle. They finished their work just as Cadan and his men arrived, having outrun the slowed Roman cohort. "They are 2 hours behind us," he reported, his face grim but alive with adrenaline. "The centurion is angry. He knows he's been played." "Let him come," Anya said, her eyes fixed on the empty defile below. "Let him bring his anger and his discipline. We will meet it with the fury of the forest." As her warriors took their positions, hidden in the trees and on the rocks above the path, Anya found a moment of quiet. She looked at her hands, smeared with dirt and pine sap. They were a healer's hands. Hands that knew how to mend and soothe. Now they were the hands of a general, preparing to maim and kill. The two identities warred within her. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother, of the heartwood. This was not a betrayal of her mother's path, she realized. It was the only way to honor it. To heal a wound, sometimes you first had to cut out the rot. Quintus was the rot. The sound of marching feet, faint at first, then growing louder, echoed from the valley. The Roman eagle was coming. Anya took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. The crimson spiral on her wrist pulsed, a beacon in the fading light. The land was ready. And so was she. Centurion Vitellius marched his cohort into the defile with a sense of grim satisfaction. The harassing attacks had stopped an hour ago. The gnats had finally fled. Before him lay the hamlet, silent and still. He saw no guards, no warriors. He smelled no wood smoke. A perfect, unsuspecting target. The prefect's orders were clear: make an example of this place. Advance with caution, he ordered, though he felt it was unnecessary. Flankers, check the trees. The legionaries moved forward, their shields locked, their discipline a shield in itself. They were halfway through the narrow pass when the world erupted. A horn blew from the rocks above, Anya's signal. The first legionaries in the column cried out in agony as the ground gave way beneath them, plunging them into the hidden pits. Their screams were cut short with sickening finality. At the same moment, the ropes were cut. Massive logs, held in tension, swung down from the hillsides with terrifying speed, crashing into the Roman formation with the force of battering rams, sending men flying and shattering the shield wall. Chaos erupted. Before Vitellius could even process the ambush, a volley of arrows rained down from the heights, finding gaps in the broken Roman lines. These were not the arrows of a trained archer corps, they were the desperate, angry shots of farmers and hunters, but there were many of them, and they were lethal. Reform. Reform the line. Testudo. Vitellius bellowed, his professional instincts taking over. His men, trained for exactly this kind of crisis, tried to obey. They began to raise their shields, forming the famed tortoise formation to protect themselves from the arrows. That was when Anya unleashed her cruelest weapon. Now, she screamed. Upstream, her warriors released the dam. A furious, pent-up wall of icy water, logs, and rock surged down the riverbed. It hit the defile like a tidal wave. The trickle of a river became a raging torrent in seconds, flooding the narrow pass, sweeping men off their feet, and turning the ground into a treacherous, churning morass of mud and water. The testudo collapsed. Men encumbered by heavy armor struggled to stand, only to be dragged down by the current. From the trees, Kadan led the charge, his warriors letting out a primal scream as they fell upon the disorganized, terrified Romans. It was not a battle of formations and tactics. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl in the mud and the water. The Britons fought with the fury of the wronged, their short swords and axes finding their marks against legionaries who could barely keep their footing. Anya watched from her command post, her heart a wild drum in her chest. This was her plan, her creation. And it was a slaughter. The healer within her recoiled in horror at the screams. The spray of blood, the sheer butchery. But the leader, the avenger, knew it was necessary. She saw Vitellius, a giant of a man, trying to rally his troops, his voice a roar of defiance over the din. He was their center. He had to fall. She pointed him out to Kadan. The centurion. Break them there. Kadan, his face a mask of joyous rage, charged towards Vitellius, 2 of his best men at his side. The centurion saw them coming. He met their charge with the cold efficiency of a lifetime of war. He parried Kadan's wild swing and ran one of his men through. But Kadan was relentless. He ducked under the centurion's counterstroke and drove his sword deep into the Roman's thigh. Vitellius roared in pain and stumbled. It was the opening they needed. The second warrior slammed his shield into the centurion, and Kadan finished the job. The fall of their leader broke what little spirit the Romans had left. The fight became a rout. Those who could, fled, scrambling back the way they came, harried by arrows and the triumphant screams of the Britons. The battle was over in less than an hour. The defile was a scene from a nightmare, choked with the bodies of nearly 50 Roman soldiers. The Britons had taken losses, 10 men, but it was a stunning, unbelievable victory. They had met a Roman cohort in open battle and destroyed it. As her people celebrated, their cheers echoing through the valley, Anya walked through the aftermath. The scent of blood was thick in the air. She knelt beside a fallen warrior from her village, a boy she had treated for a fever just last spring. His eyes stared, unseeing, at the gray sky. The cost of this victory was written on his face. The crimson spiral on her wrist seemed to burn with his lifeblood. Donal found her there. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You have given them a great victory, Anya. You have given them hope. And what have I lost, Donal? She whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Before he could answer, a scout ran up, his face grim. A survivor. We caught one. He says he's a scribe. He was asking for you. It was Marcus. He had been with the cohort, under arrest. In the chaos, he had been knocked unconscious. Anya found him tied to a tree, his face bruised, his scribe's robes torn and soaked. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. You did this. Your prefect forced our hand, Anya said, her voice cold. I know, Marcus gasped. That is why I must speak with you. Quintus will not take this as a defeat. He will see it as a personal insult. He will bring the whole legion down on you. He will scour this land until no one is left standing. But I know how to stop him. Not with swords or traps. But with this. From inside his tunic, he pulled a small, oilskin-wrapped package. He carefully opened it. Inside were 2 wax tablets. His private ledgers, Marcus said, his voice a desperate whisper. Proof that he has been stealing from Rome. Proof of his corruption. There is a legate, a rival of his, arriving in Londinium in a week's time. If this proof reaches him, Quintus will be ruined. He will be recalled in disgrace. He will be politically destroyed. Anya stared at the tablets. A weapon she had never imagined. Not a weapon of blood, but of words. Of truth. To use it, however, meant a journey to the heart of Roman power, to Londinium. A journey far more dangerous than any battle. It was a choice. To continue her bloody war in the forests, or to risk everything on a political gamble, a game of whispers in the enemy's own capital. Her decision would not just determine the fate of her rebellion, but the kind of leader she was truly meant to be. The choice fell upon Anya with the weight of a mountain. To her people, flush with a victory bought in blood, the idea of abandoning the warpath for a subtle political game felt like a betrayal. Kadan voiced the thoughts of many around the crackling fire that night. "We have them on the run," he argued, his voice ringing with passion. "We showed them that Roman steel can be broken. We should press our advantage, attack the fort itself while it is weakened. And how many more of our sons and daughters will die in that attack?" Donal countered, his voice quiet but firm. "We won a battle of surprise. In a place of our choosing. A direct assault on a fort is suicide. The scribe offers another way. A way to cut the head off the snake without losing the whole arm." All eyes turned to Anya. She looked at the wax tablets in her lap, the neat Roman script, a language of power she was only just beginning to understand. Marcus, huddled nearby, watched her, his face a mess of hope and fear. Her war had been one of fury. A direct response to a direct wound. This was different. It required cunning, patience, and a faith in the enemy's own systems of justice, or at least in their capacity for internal rivalry. "Kadan is right," Anya said, surprising everyone. "We cannot let the pressure off Quintus. He must continue to believe we are a threat here, in these woods. He must be looking for us here, not on the road to Londinium." She turned to the warrior. "You will take the main force and continue your raids. Be a ghost. A terror. Keep his eyes fixed firmly on the north." Then, she looked at Marcus. "And you and I," she said, her voice dropping, "will take these tablets to Londinium." It was a plan of audacious duality. She would be in two places at once, a fearsome legend in the forests of the Iceni, and an anonymous woman on a desperate mission to the heart of the province. The journey south was fraught with peril. Anya shed her identity as a warrior leader, trading her leathers for the simple, drab clothes of a peasant woman. She and Marcus traveled as brother and sister, refugees heading to the great city to find work. It was a common enough story. Marcus's ability to speak flawless, unaccented Latin was their shield. But Anya's appearance was a risk. Her intense eyes, her proud bearing, and the crimson triskele on her wrist, which she kept hidden under a long sleeve, marked her as different. They traveled for days, sleeping in barns and paying for passage with the few Roman coins Anya's raiders had captured. The closer they got to Londinium, the more the world changed. The wild forests gave way to neat, ordered fields. The scattered hamlets were replaced by bustling towns built on Roman grids. The air itself seemed different, thick with the smoke of 1,000 hearths and the dust of commerce. This was the world Quintus was trying to build, a world of straight lines and stone, a world that had no room for sacred groves. Anya felt like a creature from another age, an animal straying too far from its territory. Londinium was overwhelming, a sprawling, chaotic beast of noise and people. Thousands of souls from every corner of the empire thronged its streets. The languages, the smells, the sheer press of humanity was a physical assault. Here, her knowledge of roots and leaves was useless. Here, power was not in nature, but in coin and connections. Marcus, his nervousness masked by a facade of confidence, led them through the city. He had served in Londinium before and knew its ways. "The legate, Gaius Valerius, is staying at the governor's palace," he explained in a low voice. "Getting to him will be impossible. But he is a devout man. He makes a daily offering at the temple of Claudius. That is our only chance." The temple of the divine Claudius was a monument to Roman arrogance, a massive marble structure built to honor the emperor who had conquered their island. To enter it felt like a desecration of her own soul. But it was their only path. They waited. For 2 days, they watched the temple, their funds dwindling. Anya felt the eyes of the city on her. The casual scrutiny of the guards, the suspicious glances of the merchants. She was a foreign body, and the city's immune system seemed to sense it. On the third day, they saw him. The legate, Gaius Valerius, arrived in a litter, surrounded by lictors. He was an old, stern-faced man who carried himself with an air of immense authority. He swept into the temple with his retinue. "Now," Marcus breathed. "Stay close to me." They joined the throng of petitioners and priests, Marcus clutching the precious tablets. They managed to get inside, the cavernous space echoing with chants. As the legate made his offering, Marcus began to push forward. A guard blocked him. "Stand back. The legate sees no one. It is a matter of state security," Marcus hissed, holding up the tablets. "Information vital to the governor of this province." The guard hesitated. The words, state security, had power. He looked to the legate, who had overheard. Valerius turned, his gaze sharp and piercing. He saw a desperate-looking scribe and a wild-looking peasant woman. He was about to dismiss them when his eyes fell on Anya's wrist. Her sleeve had ridden up, revealing a flash of the crimson, spiraling mark. The legate's eyes widened, not in anger, but with a flicker of something else. Recognition. He gave a curt nod. "Bring them." They were led to a private chamber. The air was thick with incense. Valerius dismissed his guards. He looked from the tablets in Marcus's hands to Anya. "You are the one they call the Wraith of the Fens," he said. It was not a question. Anya's blood ran cold. It was over. This was a trap. "I am Anya of the Iceni," she said, her chin held high. "And your prefect, Tiberius Quintus, is a murderer and a thief." She presented the ledgers. The legate examined them, his face impassive. He read the details of the grain, the record of the attack on the hamlet, Marcus's annotations on Quintus's brutality. When he was done, he placed the tablets down. "Prefect Quintus has overstepped his authority," Valerius said, his voice like stone. "His corruption dishonors the name of Rome. He will be dealt with." He looked at Anya again, his gaze lingering on her birthmark. "My own mother was from Gaul. She had such a mark. She said it was a sign of the old blood." He stood up. "Your war is with Quintus, not with Rome. If he is removed, will there be peace?" Anya thought of her mother, of the heartwood, of the graves of her warriors. Peace? Perhaps not. But a chance. A breath. "If the boot is lifted from our neck," Anya said, "we will no longer have a reason to bite." The legate nodded. "Go. Leave Londinium before the day is out. I will handle Tiberius Quintus. A new prefect will be sent. One who understands the difference between governance and tyranny." Walking out of the temple, back into the chaotic streets of Londinium, Anya felt a profound shift within her. She had come seeking vengeance. She had found a different kind of victory. She had not burned the city, she had used its own mechanisms to lance a boil. Weeks later, back in the northern forests, the news arrived. Prefect Tiberius Quintus had been recalled to Rome in disgrace, to face charges of corruption. The grain tax was rescinded. The new prefect had sent envoys seeking a truce. There was no grand celebration. The cost had been too high. The scars on the land and on her people remained. Anya stood at the edge of the ruined sacred grove. The great oaks were gone, replaced by stumps and churned mud. In the center of the devastation, she knelt. From her pouch, she took the single, perfect acorn she had saved from the heartwood. With her own hands, she dug a small hole in the cold, wounded earth and planted it. As her fingers touched the soil, the crimson on her wrist softened, fading not to the calm blue of her past, but to a deep, earthy green, the color of new growth. Her war was over. But her work, the work of a healer, of a leader, of a keeper of memory, was just beginning. She was Anya of the Iceni, the Wraith of the Fens, the woman who had shown an empire that even the deepest roots, when cut, can find a way to grow again. Dynasty. Story 3. Even in the bruised twilight of Coyoacan, the wall breathed. To most, it was just the decaying flank of the old textile factory, the Fabrica de Hilo Centenario, a carcass of brick and broken promises bleeding rust onto the sidewalk. But to the few who knew where to look, it was a lung. On its vast, pockmarked surface, a pair of scarred, working-class hands, rendered in shades of earth and charcoal, tenderly released a cloud of monarch butterflies. The monarchs, each wing a stained-glass window of impossible orange, weren't flying towards the distant mountains. They were flying north, a silent, defiant exodus towards the unseen but ever-felt wall, the other wall, the one of steel and politics. This was the work of Ceniza. Ash. A ghost who painted miracles and vanished before the morning light could name her. 20 blocks away, in a workshop that smelled of turpentine, dust, and the damp earth of a potted fern slowly dying in the corner, Elara traced the curve of a butterfly wing on a sheet of mylar. Or she tried to. Her left hand, now her only hand for this delicate work, felt clumsy, a foreign tool she was still learning to command. The X-Acto knife trembled, threatening to tear the stencil. A low, insistent throb pulsed from her right shoulder, down the network of numb and hypersensitive nerves that was once her dominant arm. It was a familiar ghost. One that lived in her marrow. She closed her eyes. Asterisk screeching tires. The smell of gasoline, thick and sweet like rotting flowers. The impossible percussion of metal on metal. The shattering glass, a sudden, crystalline symphony. And a voice, her friend's voice, cut short, asterisk. Elara's breath hitched. She slammed the knife down, the clatter echoing in the small room. The throb in her shoulder sharpened into a piercing spike. 2 years. 2 years, and the ghost still knew how to find her in the quiet moments. She pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the concrete floor, and limped towards the small, barred window. The sky was the color of a day-old bruise. She needed air. She needed noise. Anything to drown out the silence where the ghost lived. Her phone buzzed on the workbench, a harsh, electric sound. She ignored it. It was probably just Mateo again, the relentless blogger from Chronicas de Coyoacan. For weeks, he'd been obsessed with Ceniza. His latest post, a lyrical analysis of the butterfly mural, had been shared hundreds of times. Ceniza doesn't just paint walls, he'd written. Asterisk, she gives the city a soul. She reminds us that even in the forgotten places, beauty persists. But who is this phantom of hope? Who is Ceniza? Asterisk. The question made her skin crawl. Hope. He called it hope. Elara called it survival. Each mural was an exorcism, a way to take the churning chaos inside her, the pain, the grief, the rage, and give it a shape, a form, a place to exist that wasn't behind her own ribs. She painted the stories of others, the resilience of the market vendors, the quiet dignity of the old woman who swept the same patch of sidewalk every day, the defiant joy of children playing soccer in the shadow of the border, because she could no longer illustrate her own. Her career as a meticulous, right-handed illustrator of botanical textbooks had died in the wreckage on the highway to Puebla. Ceniza was what had crawled out of the ash. The phone buzzed again, insistent. Annoyed, she grabbed it. A dozen notifications. Mateo's blog was trending again, but it wasn't about her mural. It was a new post. Her thumb hovered, then tapped. The screen filled with a glossy, professional photograph. A man in a tailored navy suit, his smile as polished and artificial as his shoes, shaking hands with a city official. Behind them, unmistakable, was the butterfly mural on the wall of the old factory. The headline felt like a punch to the gut. Asterisk Vargas Corp secures landmark deal. Historic Centenario factory to be razed for La Marola luxury lofts. Demolition slated for next month. Asterisk. Elara read it once. Then twice. The word swam. Asterisk raised. Luxury lofts. Demolition, asterisk the throb in her shoulder became a roar. She looked from the photograph of the smiling man, Ricardo Vargas, to the unfinished butterfly stencil on her workbench. He wasn't just tearing down a building. He was tearing down a lung. He was silencing a voice. He was erasing a memory. And in that moment, the quiet, reclusive artist felt something she hadn't felt since the ghost first took up residence in her bones, the cold, clarifying fire of pure rage. The phantom of hope was about to become a fighter. The first move Vargas made was subtle, almost surgical. A week after the announcement, a smaller ceniza piece, a mural depicting a stray dog with constellations in its fur, curled asleep on a bakery wall, was gone. In its place was a flat, sterile expanse of beige paint. It wasn't just covered, it was obliterated. The color was an insult, a void where life had been. Elara saw it on her way to buy coffee. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It felt like a personal violation, like Vargas had reached into her chest and painted a patch of her heart beige. She could feel the stares of passers-by. The sad, knowing glances of the bakery owner. They didn't know she was ceniza, but they knew the loss of the sleeping dog. It was a small death in a city that saw too many big ones. That night, sleep was impossible. The ghost was loud, whispering of loss and erasure. But the rage was louder. Before dawn, she was back at the beige wall. She worked with a ferocity that bordered on frenzy, her left hand moving with a newfound certainty. She didn't use a stencil this time. She painted freehand, her movements raw and jagged. When the sun rose, the beige wall was gone. In its place, rendered in furious strokes of crimson and black, was a massive, anatomical heart, wrapped tight in barbed wire. But it wasn't dying. It was defiantly, impossibly, beating. Veins and arteries pulsed with vibrant life, straining against the metal thorns. It was a declaration of war. Mateo was there by 7 a.m. His phone was already out, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and journalistic fervor. He knew. There was no doubt in his mind now. The timing, the raw emotion, it had to be the same artist. He spent the next 3 days trying to find her, his journalistic instincts overriding his hesitation. He spoke to paint store owners, corner grocers, old men who sat on park benches all day. He showed them a picture of the barbed wire heart. Have you seen anyone? Someone buying a lot of crimson paint. Someone who looks like they have a story to tell. He found her in a small papeleria buying black ink. It was the way she held her right arm, unnaturally still, a silent partner to her active left, that gave her away. He'd seen that kind of stillness before, in athletes with career-ending injuries. Elara, he said, his voice softer than he intended. She froze. Her back to him, her hand hovering over a bottle of ink. She didn't turn. I don't know you. My name is Mateo. I run the Chronicus blog. He took a hesitant step closer. The heart. The barbed wire. That was you. It was a response. She finally turned, her eyes guarded, her face a pale, strained mask. You're mistaken. Am I? He held up his phone, showing her a picture of the heart mural. He painted over the dog. And you gave the street back its heartbeat. I'm not here to expose you. I'm here because, what you're doing matters. And he's going to erase it all. Let me help. Let me document it. Before it's all just, beige. The word hung in the air between them. Beige. The color of nothing. Elara looked at his earnest face, his genuine plea. The fear of being seen was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest. But the thought of her work vanishing without a trace, of Vargas winning so easily, was worse. She gave a single, sharp nod, the barest minimum of consent, and turned back to the ink. A reluctant, fragile alliance was born in the quiet aisle of a stationery shop. Their partnership was a dance of caution. She never invited him to her workshop, that sacred space of pain and creation. They met in quiet cafes or late-night Ticarius. He would film her from a distance as she worked, a shadow documenting a ghost. He learned her rhythms, the way she would pause and massage her right shoulder, her face contorting in a silent grimace, the intense, almost meditative focus that descended when she was deep in a piece, the way her entire body seemed to pour its energy through her left arm. She began to talk, in clipped, hesitant sentences at first. Then in a flood of frustration and grief. She told him about the accident. About her right hand, how the nerves were a jumble of static and fire, how the doctors said she would never hold a brush again. They told me to find a new hobby, she said, her voice laced with a bitter irony. As if this was a choice. She told him about the name, Sinisa. After the crash, everything felt like ash. My career. My future, my friend, me. For a year, I was just dust. Then I realized you can't kill ash. It's what's left. It's where things can grow again. As she spoke, Matteo filmed, not just her words, but the story her body told. He saw the resilience, but he also saw the cost. Vargas, meanwhile, escalated his campaign. He didn't just paint over her murals now, he power-washed them, stripping the brick bare. Leaving no trace. He hired private security to patrol the areas around his properties. In a television interview, he called the street art a symptom of the urban decay we are working to cure, his smile never faltering. We are bringing progress, safety, and value to Coyoacan. Watching the interview on her phone, Elara felt a wave of nausea. His words were so clean, so reasonable. He was turning her art into a disease and himself into the cure. That night, the ghost was back, its whispers amplified by Vargas's sterile rhetoric. Asterisk, he's right. It's just filth. You're just making a mess. You're broken. Your art is broken, asterisk. She found herself standing in front of the butterfly wall, the factory looming like a tombstone. The security guards eyed her from across the street. She felt small, powerless. The pain in her shoulder was a sharp, biting counterpoint to the ache in her heart. She almost turned back. She almost let the beige win. But then she looked at the butterflies, her beautiful, fragile monarchs, flying towards a wall of steel. They weren't afraid. They were on a journey. They had a purpose. And so did she. She went home and pulled out a fresh sheet of mylar. Her hand was shaking, but she gripped the knife tighter. Vargas wanted to erase her. Fine. She would create something that could never be erased because it was never meant to last. An idea began to form, an idea born of light and memory, a final, defiant act for a wall on death row. She had 10 days. The 10 days were a blur of pain and purpose. Elara's workshop, once a refuge, became a command center. The floor was littered with discarded sketches, empty ink bottles, and coils of electrical cable. Her project was more ambitious than anything she had ever attempted. It wasn't just a mural. It was a resurrection. The idea was simple in concept, monumental in execution. She would paint a base portrait on the factory wall, but the soul of the piece would be light. A projection. A fleeting, living ghost on a dying building. Matteo became her lifeline. He sourced a powerful, portable projector and a generator, his journalistic contacts proving useful for more than just leads. He became her second pair of hands. Cutting massive stencils under her exacting direction, his respect for her process growing with every meticulous slice. He saw the toll it was taking. There were days she could barely lift her arm, her face pale and slick with the sweat of her fight against the constant, grinding pain. You don't have to do this, Elara, he said one afternoon, finding her slumped over her workbench, her right arm cradled against her chest. You've already made your point. He thinks he can just wipe a place clean, she whispered, her voice rough with exhaustion. He thinks memory is just dirt you can wash away. This isn't just for me. It's for her. It was the first time she had mentioned her friend, Elena, by name. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. The portrait, it's her face. Matteo fell silent, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just a battle against Vargas. It was a memorial. A eulogy written in light. Vargas, for his part, seemed to sense a final battle was coming. He doubled the security around the factory. The demolition date was moved up by 2 days. A massive, professionally printed banner was stretched across the front of the building, covering a third of her butterfly mural. It showed a CGI rendering of the future La Marola lofts. Gleaming glass, sterile balconies, and smiling, ethnically ambiguous models sipping wine. The banner read, *El futuro es limpio. The future is clean. *. The slogan was a direct attack. It galvanized Alara. The final design was locked in. The base portrait of Elena would be faint, almost translucent, like a memory. The projector, which Matteo would control from a hidden vantage point on a nearby rooftop, would then overlay a flowing loop of images onto the portrait, dozens of faces from the community that Matteo had been photographing for weeks. The market vendor, the shoemaker, the kids playing football, the old woman with the broom. Elena's face would become a vessel, holding the faces of the neighborhood she had loved. A single life containing multitudes. The night of the demolition arrived. The air was thick with the nervous energy that precedes a storm. The factory was floodlit, the security guards on high alert. Getting in was the first hurdle. Alara had scouted a weak point in the rear fence, a section obscured by overgrown bougainvillea. Ready? Matteo asked, his backpack heavy with the projector and camera gear. Alara took a deep breath, the cold night air stinging her lungs. She looked at her right hand, then her left. One was a memory of what was. The other a testament to what is. No, she said with a wry, tired smile. But let's go anyway. They moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the city's hum. The fence was easy. The true challenge was the wall itself. Alara had a rope and grappling hook, but the climb would be agony on her shoulder. She refused Matteo's offer to help. This was her ascent. She began to climb, the rough brick scraping her knuckles. Every upward pull was a fresh spike of fire in her shoulder. The ghost was screaming now, a cacophony of fear and pain. You'll fall. You'll fail. You're not strong enough, she paused halfway up, her body trembling, her forehead pressed against the cold brick. She thought of Elena's laugh. She thought of the beige wall. She thought of Vargas's clean future. She kept climbing. Once she was in position, secured by a harness, she began to work. The world narrowed to the circle of her headlamp, the hiss of the spray can, the vast, dark canvas of the wall. She wasn't just painting a face, she was summoning a spirit. The lines were soft, ethereal. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. On the rooftop opposite, Matteo set up his equipment. He had the projector aimed and ready. He also had a small drone. Its camera prepped to capture the full scale of the event. On his phone, he typed a quick message to a curated list of local activists and journalists, Fabrica de Hilos Centenario. Midnight. Ceniza's final word. #Ceniza resist. He hit send. Just as Alara sprayed the final, ghostly highlight on Elena's cheek, a beam of light cut through the darkness from below. A powerful flashlight. Hey! Up there! Stay where you are, a voice boomed. Security. And standing beside the guard, illuminated in the harsh glare, was Ricardo Vargas himself. He must have been tipped off. He looked up, his face a mask of cold fury. I should have known you'd try a pathetic stunt like this, he yelled, his voice echoing off the factory walls. Vandalism to the very end. It changes nothing. In the morning, all of this will be rubble. Alara, hanging from her harness, exhausted and in pain, simply looked down at him. Her work was done. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards Matteo's rooftop. "It's not for you," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the still night air. And then, Matteo hit the switch. The light hit the wall with the force of a revelation. One moment, there was just the faint, ghostly outline of a face. The next, Elena was there. Her image, 20 feet high, wasn't solid, but woven from pure light, her eyes looking out over the city she had loved. She was smiling. For a breathtaking second, there was silence. Even Vargas and the security guards were stunned, their flashlights forgotten. Then, the magic began. The faces started to flow. Projected from Matteo's vantage point, the portraits he had taken washed over Elena's features, merging with her, becoming her. The weathered face of a corn seller from the mercado, his eyes full of a lifetime of stories. The laughing face of a young girl with ribbons in her hair. The tired, proud face of a mechanic, his hands permanently stained with grease. Dozens of faces, a river of humanity, flowed across the wall, each one telling a piece of Coyoacan's story. The silent factory wall had been given a voice. A memory, a soul. Vargas recovered first, his shock curdling back into rage. "What is this circus?" he snarled, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the police. This is trespassing. Destruction of private property." "You call it destruction," a voice called out from the darkness beyond the fence. "We call it art." Heads turned. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by Matteo's alert. At first, it was a dozen people. Then 2, then 50. Phones were raised, their small screens creating a constellation of digital witnesses. Matteo's drone whirred to life, ascending silently into the night sky, capturing the entire scene, the monumental, living mural, the small figure of Alara hanging against it like a defiant spider, the impotent rage of Vargas below, and the growing crowd bearing witness. The confrontation was no longer between a developer and a lone artist. It was between a corporation and a community. "This building is condemned." Vargas shouted at the crowd, his voice strained. "This is progress. You are standing in the way of the future." "This is our past," someone yelled back. "And our present." Alara watched it all unfold from her perch. She was detached, floating. The pain in her shoulder was a distant hum. She had poured everything, her grief, her pain, her love for this broken, beautiful city, onto that wall. Her work was done. It didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to them. To the faces in the light. To the people at the fence. The wail of police sirens cut through the night. The crowd murmured, but no one moved. They held their ground, their phones still held high, a silent, digital barricade. The police arrived, their flashing lights adding a frantic, strobing rhythm to the projected faces on the wall. They conferred with Vargas, their expressions grim. They had a trespassing complaint, but they also had a crowd and a dozen journalists live streaming. It was a volatile situation. Vargas, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, made a final, desperate move. He gestured to his security guards. "Get her down from there. Now." But as the guards moved towards the wall, a low chant began to ripple through the crowd. Ceniza. 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 Asterisk. It started as a whisper and grew into a roar, a wave of sound that washed over the sirens, over Vargas's angry shouts, over everything. They weren't chanting for Alara, they didn't know her name. They were chanting for the idea she represented. For the ghost who had given them a voice. Hanging in the air, bathed in the light of the faces she had immortalized. Alara closed her eyes. She let the sound wash over her. It was the sound of a lung breathing. The sound of a heart beating against barbed wire. It was the sound of ash beginning to grow again. The police, seeing the situation could quickly spiral, made a decision. They held Vargas back. They would wait until morning. The night, and the wall, belonged to Ceniza. Dawn broke gray and weary over Coyoacan. The crowd had thinned, but a core of silent sentinels remained, their phones long dead, their vigil kept with tired eyes. The projection had faded with the first light, leaving only the faint, chalky ghost of Elena's face on the wall. It looked like a shroud. From a rooftop 2 blocks away, Elara and Matteo watched as the demolition crew moved in. There was no ceremony. A massive yellow excavator, its claw like the mandible of a prehistoric insect, lumbered forward. It paused for a moment before the wall, a predator assessing its prey. Then, with a groan of stressed hydraulics and a screech of metal, it swung. The claw bit into the brick right where the butterflies had been. The wall shuddered. Brick and mortar rained down in a cloud of red dust. Elara didn't flinch. She watched with a strange, hollow calm. Each blow of the excavator felt both earth-shatteringly loud and completely silent. She was watching a body being dismembered, but she knew the soul had already escaped. Matteo stood beside her, his camera recording, though he wasn't looking through the viewfinder. His eyes were on Elara. Her face was impassive, but he could see the tremor in her left hand, the rigid set of her jaw. "We should go," he said softly. She didn't answer. She just watched until the section with Elena's face collapsed inward, vanishing into a pile of rubble. Only then did she turn away. "It's done," she said, her voice flat. The walk back to her workshop was a blur. The city was waking up, the smells of coffee and exhaust filling the air. It felt like any other day, but something fundamental had shifted. The physical evidence of her greatest act of defiance was gone. The next 48 hours were a digital explosion. Matteo, fueled by coffee and a sense of historic duty, edited his footage into a powerful, 5-minute documentary short. He intercut the stunning drone shots of the final, living mural with the raw, ground-level footage of the confrontation, the chanting crowd, and Vargas's furious face. He laid Elara's anonymous voice, taken from their interviews, over the images. "He thinks memory is just dirt you can wash away." The video ended with a single, slow-motion shot of the wall crumbling to dust. He titled it La Última Palabra de Ceniza, Ceniza's last word, and posted it. It didn't just go viral, it became a phenomenon. #CenizaResist was the #1 trend in Mexico, then globally. The video was shared by major artists, activists, and celebrities. News outlets from The Guardian to Al Jazeera ran stories, not just about a destroyed mural, but about the global fight between community culture and corporate gentrification. Ceniza was no longer a local phantom, she was an international symbol of artistic resistance. Vargas's La Marola project was now infamous, its future uncertain as investors grew wary of the toxic publicity. He had won the property, but he had lost the story. A week later, Elara was in her workshop. The space felt different, quieter. The ghost in her shoulder was still there, a dull ache instead of a sharp spike. It was tired, too. She was sketching in a small notebook, simple shapes, testing the strength in her hand. Matteo knocked on her door. He looked tired but energized. "It got into a film festival," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "An international one. They want to fly the director out. They think the director is Ceniza." Elara looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "Tell them Ceniza is a resident of Coyoacán and cannot travel." He nodded, understanding. Her secret was safe. Her legacy isn't, though. It's everywhere now. It's bigger than any wall. "It was never about the walls," Elara said, looking past him, through her small, barred window. Across the alley, a vast, blank brick wall of a neighboring warehouse seemed to bake in the afternoon sun. It was a scarred, imperfect, forgotten surface. To anyone else, it was just an empty space. To Elara, it looked like a fresh page. The pain in her arm gave a familiar throb, a quiet question. Her left hand, stained with the memory of ink and paint, flexed in response. The story wasn't over. It was just waiting for a new wall to be written on. Dynasty. Story 4. The lie was the color of crushed lapis, a blue so deep it was a piece of the night sky given form. Kenemon dipped his finest brush, its bristles cut from the tail of a desert cat, into the precious pigment. On the limestone wall of the vizier's tomb, the goddess Nut began to arch her celestial body over the world, her skin the sacred blue that cost more than a man's life. He worked by the flickering, greasy light of an oil lamp, the air thick with its smoke and the scent of stone dust. Here, deep beneath the Theban cliffs, silence was a physical presence, broken only by the soft hiss of his brush on the plaster. This was his world, a holy space carved for a dead man's eternity. And it was built on a lie. Kenemon knew this with a certainty that sat like an undigested stone in his gut. He knew the vizier Passer, the man for whom this palace of the afterlife was being built. He had seen Passer order a farmer beaten for being short on his grain tax. Had heard his cruel laughter as the man's wife pleaded for mercy. Now, Kenemon was painting Passer being welcomed into the field of reeds by a smiling Osiris, his soul declared pure, his heart lighter than the feather of Maat. With each stroke, Kenemon felt the duality of his existence. A profound pride in his art, in the steady hand that could coax a god's face from a blank wall, warred with a corrosive cynicism. He was a master craftsman, one of the Medjay of Set Mot, the place of truth. He was privileged. He was fed. And he was a highly paid liar for the dead. He finished a star on Nut's body, a perfect five-pointed speck of yellow ochre, and leaned back. The goddess was beautiful. The lie was exquisite. His work done for the day, he cleaned his brushes with a practiced, gentle motion. He packed his pigments, the sacred lapis locked away in a small wooden box, and emerged from the tomb's sloping passage, blinking against the savage white glare of the sun. The heat was a physical blow. The valley of the king stretched before him, a place of silent, watchful grandeur, its limestone cliffs shimmering under a sky the color of a faded turquoise bead. It was a valley of gods and kings, and he was just a man with paint on his hands, walking the dusty path back to the world of the living. His village, known to its inhabitants as the place of truth, was a grid of cramped mud brick houses huddled within a high wall, a testament to the value of its residents. They were the king's most skilled artisans, and thus, the king's most valuable property. The air here was different from the tomb's sterile silence. It smelled of baking bread, of donkeys, of sweat, and of life. Children's laughter echoed off the walls, a sound both precious and fragile. He pushed open the simple wooden door to his home. The interior was cool and dim. His wife, Merit, looked up from grinding grain, her movements rhythmic and weary. Her face, usually a source of calm for him, was tight with worry. "You are late," she said, her voice low. "The goddess required my time," he replied, touching her shoulder. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes and knew she was not talking about his work. His daughter, Iset, a small girl of 4 with his own dark, watchful eyes, ran to him and clung to his leg. He lifted her, her small weight a warm and solid truth against his chest. She smelled of the sun and the sweet dates she'd been eating. In this small, cramped room, with this woman and this child, was the only truth that mattered. Everything else, the gods, the pharaohs, the glorious afterlife, was a story told to keep the world from falling apart. He looked at Merit. He knew her fear was not unfounded. It lived in their house like a third resident, a shadow born 5 years ago in the week their firstborn son, a boy with Merit's smile, had burned with a fever and turned to dust in their arms. That loss had scoured away his faith, leaving only a fierce, protective love for what remained. Later that evening, the tension in his home found its source. A commotion in the village street drew them to their doorway. In the center of a gathering crowd stood Nakt, the overseer, his tall frame rigid with authority. His acacia staff was held tight in one hand, the polished wood dark like dried blood. Before him, 2 guards held a struggling figure. It was Baku, Kenemon's friend, a painter whose skill was matched only by his recklessness. This man, Nakt's voice cut through the murmurs, cold and sharp as an obsidian blade, is a thief. He has stolen from the sacred stores of the pharaoh, life, health, strength be upon him. He has taken the pigment of the gods for his own worthless pleasure. Baku, his face flushed with wine and defiance, spat on the ground. The gods have more lapis than they know what to do with. Paseir can greet Osiris in plain yellow for all I care. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was one thing to think such thoughts, it was madness to speak them. Kenamon felt Merit's hand grip his arm, her nails digging into his skin. Nak's face did not change. He did not raise his voice. He simply gave a slight nod. The guards threw Baku to the ground. Nak raised his staff. The sound that followed was not loud, a wet, solid thud, but it echoed in the pit of Kenamon's stomach. Once. Twice. Baku's defiant shouts turned into a choked sob. 20 lashes, Nak announced to the silent village. And then he will be sent to the quarries of Gebel el-Silsila. Let his hands, which have defiled the sacred, learn the weight of stone. A death sentence delivered with bureaucratic calm. Kenamon stood frozen, a pillar of silent, impotent rage. He saw Baku's eyes find his in the crowd, a look of wild, pleading terror. And Kenamon did nothing. He stood, his wife's hand of ice on his arm, his daughter hiding behind his legs, and watched as his friend was dragged away, leaving a smear of blood on the dusty ground. The lie wasn't just on the tomb walls. It was in their silence, in their acceptance. It was the price of survival. As he led his family back into the suffocating safety of their home, the beautiful, exquisite lie he had served all day choked him. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Kenamon lay on the reed mat, the warmth of Merit and Iset beside him a stark contrast to the cold dread that filled his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Baku's face. He heard the sickening thud of Nak's staff. He felt the weight of his own stillness, his own cowardice. The silence of his home was a tomb. And he was being buried alive in it. He rose before the first hint of dawn, his movements stiff. The village was quiet, the air cool against his skin. He didn't light a lamp. He sat in the darkness, the tools of his trade laid out before him on a clean cloth. Brushes. Palettes. A small grinder for pigments. These were the instruments of his complicity. He had used them to create beauty for the undeserving. To perpetuate the grand, glittering falsehood that kept men like Nak in power and sent men like Baku to their deaths. A thought, sharp and dangerous as a shard of flint, pierced the fog of his grief. If his hands could paint lies with such skill, could they not also paint the truth? What if, within the vizier's eternal house of deception, he could hide a single, small testament to what was real? An image not of gods and kings, but of men. Of suffering. Of a friend's betrayal. Of a child's last breath. The idea was madness. The punishment for desecrating a tomb was not merely death, but an agonizing death designed to destroy one's soul for eternity. They would flay him alive, impale him, leave his body for the crocodiles. And Merit and Iset, they would be cast out, left to starve. He picked up a lump of common red ochre, the color of dried blood and the earth of their own world. He crushed it against a stone pallet, the gritty sound filling the silence. It was the color of Baku's suffering. He found a piece of charcoal from the hearth. The color of despair. He would not use the sacred, expensive pigments of the pharaoh. He would use the pigments of their own world, of the ground beneath their feet, of the ashes of their fires. This would not be a grand rebellion. It would be a secret. A whisper against a roar. He would find a small, insignificant panel on the tomb wall, one that would be plastered over last, and there he would paint his truth. It was a fool's errand, a prayer offered to no god he believed in. But it was the only penance he could imagine. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in his stomach. But for the first time since he had watched Baku being dragged away, he felt a flicker of something other than shame. He felt a purpose. A dangerous, terrifying, and utterly necessary purpose. The following days at the tomb were a torment of dual realities. Outwardly, Kenamon was a model of diligence. He painted the vizier's barge journeying across the lily-choked waters toward the west, his hand as steady as ever. He mixed the vibrant greens from malachite, the brilliant whites from chalk. His movements precise and economical. He answered Nak's questions with the correct measure of deference, his eyes downcast. But inwardly, his mind was a whirlwind of conspiracy. He identified the perfect spot for his secret, a small, rough-hewn section of the wall in an antechamber, behind where a large chest of funerary goods was destined to be placed. It was scheduled to be the last surface smoothed with plaster. He began smuggling his humble pigments into the tomb, a lump of charcoal hidden in his loincloth, a pouch of powdered ochre tucked into his bread ration. Each day was a tightrope walk over a pit of fire. His new obsession did not go unnoticed. Merit watched him, her eyes filled with a knowing dread. He was quieter, his sleep disturbed by nightmares. He ate little. One evening, as he was grinding a piece of yellow iron oxide on a small stone in the corner of their home, she confronted him. "What are you doing, Kenamon?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, so Iset would not hear. He did not look at her. "It is just a new pigment I am testing." "Do not lie to me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "I see it in your eyes. This is about Baku. You are doing something foolish. Something that will get us killed." He finally met her gaze. "I am doing something necessary." "Necessary?" Her voice rose. "What is necessary is feeding our daughter. What is necessary is staying invisible to men like Nacht. We have already buried one child. Do you wish to make Iset an orphan?" The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. He saw the tomb of their son in his mind, a small, unmarked grave in the village cemetery. He remembered the feel of the boy's tiny, cooling body in his arms. The grief was a fresh wound. "This is for him," Kenamon said, his voice raw. "It is for Baku. It is so their lives, their suffering, are not just nothing. Not just dust blown away by the wind. I am painting them into a place of eternity. The real them. You are painting us into a grave." Merit cried, tears finally breaking free. "Your pride, your art. It is not worth more than our daughter's life." The conflict hung between them, thick and suffocating. She saw only the risk. He saw only the moral imperative. They were both right, and that was the tragedy. He could not stop, and she could not understand. From that day on, a chasm of fearful silence opened between them. He would work on his secret project, and she would watch, her face a mask of love and terror. The walls of the tomb seemed to breathe with Kenamon's fear. Every distant scrape of a stone, every cough from another chamber, sent a jolt of panic through him. He worked on his secret mural in stolen moments, a few minutes while his assistant was mixing plaster, a precious half-hour during the midday meal when the tomb was mostly empty. He did not paint gods. He began with a face he knew better than his own, his son's, as he had looked in the final hours of his fever, his eyes wide with confusion and pain. The image was raw, rendered in soft charcoal and the pale yellow of the desert earth. It was an act of agonizing remembrance. Next, he painted Baku. Not the laughing, boastful Baku of the tavern, but the man on the ground, his face contorted in a silent scream as Nacht's staff fell. He used the red ochre, the color of blood and life, to capture the brutal truth of that moment. He painted the faces of his fellow workers around the edges. Their expressions not of beatific calm as in the official art, but of weary resignation, of the deep, bone-tired exhaustion that was their constant companion. He worked from memory, each face a study in silent endurance. This hidden corner of the tomb became his confessional, his own private book of the dead, one that told of the passage not to a glorious afterlife, but through a life of hardship. The act of painting was a release. The fear was immense, but the feeling of creating something true, something that defied the gilded cage of his profession, was a potent antidote. He was no longer just a liar. He was a witness. His obsession, however, began to fray the edges of his composure. Nacht, with his predator's instinct for weakness, noticed. The overseer began to appear at Kenneman's side more frequently, his presence a heavy cloak of menace. "You seem distracted. Painter," Nacht commented one afternoon, his eyes scanning the perfectly executed frieze of offering bearers Kenneman had just completed. "Your hand is as skilled as ever, but your thoughts are wandering." "The heat drains the spirit, overseer," Kenneman murmured, not meeting his gaze. "The spirit finds strength in service to the divine will," Nacht replied, his voice a low threat. "The vizier's journey must be perfect. The gods see every detail. And so do I." He would run his hand along the wall, tapping it with his staff, his footsteps unnervingly silent. Kenneman felt his skin crawl. He was certain Nacht suspected something, though he could not know what. The overseer was a hunter, and he had scented something amiss, something out of the rigid order he enforced with such zeal. The psychological pressure mounted. Kenneman started seeing Nacht's shadow in every corner, hearing his voice in the whisper of the wind through the valley. The tomb, once his sanctuary of art, was becoming a trap. His secret mural, his act of liberation, now felt like a stone he was carving for his own neck. The closer he got to finishing it, the more certain he became that it would be the last thing he ever painted. The day arrived like a judgment. A foreman announced that the priests would be coming at dusk to begin the preliminary rituals for sealing the antechamber. Kenneman had 1 day left. His mural was nearly complete. He had painted the faces, the scenes of suffering, the small, heartbreaking details of their real lives. Only one figure remained to be added. The source of the immediate suffering. The agent of the pitiless order. Nacht. He entered the tomb that morning with a sense of fatalistic calm. The fear had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, clear resolve. He would finish it. Whatever the cost, the truth would be whole. He worked through the morning, his hands moving with a feverish intensity. He used a mixture of soot and ash to capture the cold darkness of the overseer's robes, the hard line of his jaw. He was painting the image of Nacht as he had looked when he'd sentenced Baku. His staff held high, his face a mask of righteous conviction. It was in the heat of the afternoon, when the sun was at its most punishing and the other workers were taking their meager meal in the shade, that the shadow fell across his doorway. "You work through the rest period, painter," a low voice said. "Such devotion is commendable." Kenneman's heart seized. He turned slowly. Nacht stood there, alone. His imposing figure blocking the light. His eyes were not on the main walls, but on Kenneman himself. "I wish to have a final look," Nacht said, stepping into the chamber. "Before the priests fill it with their chants and smoke. To ensure all is in accordance with Ma'at." This was it. The moment he had both dreaded and, on some level, anticipated. He pressed himself back against the wall, trying to shield his secret panel with his body. Nacht walked through the room. His staff tapping lightly on the stone floor. He was like a great hunting cat, circling its prey, savoring the final moments. He commented on the official art, his voice a low monologue. "The colors are vibrant. The lines are pure. The vizier will be pleased." He paused before a depiction of the weighing of the heart. Truth. A delicate thing. His heart must be light, free from the heavy burden of sin. He turned his gaze on Kenneman. "Your heart, painter. Is it light?" "I am a humble servant of the pharaoh and the gods, overseer," Kenneman said, his voice a dry rasp. "Are you?" Nacht took a step closer. "I see your skill. It is a gift from the gods. But I have watched you. Your eyes do not hold the reverence of a true believer. They hold something else. Something hidden." Nacht was now only a few feet from him, his gaze fixed on the section of wall Kenneman was hiding. Kenneman could smell the scent of old sweat and authority on him. "What is on this wall, Kenneman?" Nacht asked, his voice soft, almost conversational. This last, rough patch you seem so protective of. It is nothing, overseer. An unfinished surface, waiting for the plasterers. Show me. It was not a request. Kinemon knew he was trapped. A refusal would be an admission of guilt. He had to move. He prayed to every god he had ever disbelieved in. And stepped aside. Nak's eyes fell upon the wall. For a moment, he simply stared. Kinemon held his breath, waiting for the explosion, for the call to the guards, for the feel of the staff on his own skull. The overseer leaned closer, his eyes tracing the raw, earthen figures. He saw the face of the dying child. He saw the faces of the exhausted workers. He saw Baku's silent scream. Kinemon had left the final figure. Nak's own, incomplete. The face was there, but the staff in his hand was only an outline. Nak was silent for a full minute, an eternity in the suffocating confines of the tomb. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. This, Nak said finally, his voice a strange, tight rasp, is chaos. This is the world without order. This is sickness. This is grief. This is not for the eyes of the gods. He did not look at Kinemon. He continued to stare at the wall. The vizier's journey must be perfect, he repeated, as if reciting a creed. There can be no stain of this world's misery in his eternal house. He turned to Kinemon, and for the first time, Kinemon saw something other than cold authority in his eyes. He saw a flicker of profound, fanatical conviction. Nak truly believed he was a bulwark against the darkness he was now witnessing. The plasterers are coming, Nak said. I will tell them this section requires an extra thick coat. It is porous. Unstable. He looked directly at Kinemon. And you, painter. You will finish your work. The official work. Perfectly. And you will forget this, sickness, ever touched your hands. You will forget it, or you will follow your friend Baku to a place where you will have an eternity to contemplate disorder. He turned and walked out of the tomb without another word. Kinemon leaned against the wall, his legs trembling so violently he could barely stand. He was alive. He was undiscovered. Nacht had seen his truth not as rebellion, but as a contagion, a filth to be scrubbed and hidden away. In his zeal for order, he had missed the defiance and seen only a mess to be cleaned. In a final, desperate act of nerve, Kinemon picked up his brush, dipped it in the black ash. And in the few moments he had left, he completed the mural. He painted the raised staff in Nak's hand, the instrument of his brutal order. The truth was now whole. The priests arrived as the sun began to bleed across the western cliffs, painting the valley in hues of fire and gold. Their chants filled the air, ancient, melodic words meant to guide the vizier's soul. Kinemon stood amongst the other artisans. His face a mask of weary reverence. He watched as the masons approached the antechamber, their trowels ready. He saw them apply the thick, wet layer of plaster to the wall, right over his secret. The white gypsum covered the faces of his son, of Baku, of Nacht, sealing them in an eternal, silent darkness. A strange sense of peace settled over him. It was done. His truth was now a part of the vizier's grand lie. A secret heart beating within the stone. No one would ever see it. But he would know it was there. It was an anonymous prayer, an act of remembrance that could never be erased. He had not changed the world. He had not saved his friend. But he had refused to let their suffering be forgotten. In the great, cosmic scheme of Ma'at, it was less than a whisper. But for him, it was everything. The work on the tomb was finished. The artisans of Set Mot were assigned to a new project, a lesser noble's resting place. The rhythm of life, of toil and obedience, resumed. A few weeks later, a trader returning from the south brought news from the quarries at Gebel el Silsila. He spoke of the heat, the back-breaking labor, and the men who dropped from exhaustion and were buried in the sand where they fell. He mentioned a reckless painter from Thebes who had lasted less than a month before a fever. Or perhaps a broken spirit, had claimed him. The news reached Kinemon as he was sharing his evening meal of bread and lentils with Merit. She saw the look on his face and knew. She said nothing, but reached across the small space between them and placed her hand on his. It was a gesture of shared sorrow, of understanding. The chasm between them had closed. She still did not condone his risk, but she understood the grief that had driven it. Baku was gone. His story was over. But Kinemon had ensured he was not forgotten. That night, Kinemon did not dream of tombs or overseers. He dreamt of his son, not feverish and dying, but laughing, running through a field of reeds that seemed to stretch on forever. He woke to the soft weight of Iset crawling onto his mat. She curled up beside him, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper. He watched her in the grey pre-dawn light. She was his living truth, the future he had fought to protect in his own quiet way. He picked up a piece of scrap wood and a small knife. He began to carve, his hands moving with the same skill he applied to the walls of the pharaoh's tombs. He carved a small, simple cat, its back arched, its tail curved. A toy. A small, unimportant thing in a world of monumental structures. He gave it to Iset when she woke. Her face lit up with a joy so pure it was a light in the dim room. He held her, the small wooden cat clutched in her hand, and felt the ache in his own heart ease, just for a moment. The story ends here. Kinemon stands at the doorway of his home, watching Iset play in the dust. He looks out, beyond the village walls, to the west, where the sun is setting behind the Valley of the Kings. The great tombs, the eternal houses of the powerful, stand in silent silhouette against the dying light. They are monuments to power, to glory, to a history that would be written by scribes and kings. But Kinemon knows that hidden deep inside one of them, buried under a layer of plaster and lies, is a different story. A story of a child's fever, a friend's scream, and a father's grief. A story that is small, and secret, and true. He is an anonymous man, a painter whose name will be lost to time. But his work, his real work, endures in the dark, waiting. He turns from the valley of the dead and goes back inside, to the small, fragile, and stubbornly persistent world of the living.